The flood came at midnight, and the man they'd all mocked was the only one who knew what to do. Daniel Crane wasn't supposed to be a hero. He was the mail-order husband who stepped off that train with a violin instead of a gun, the school teacher everyone laughed at, the gentle fool who didn't belong in rough Colorado territory. But when the river turned savage and the bridge collapsed, trapping an entire town between rising water and darkness, this laughingstock became their last hope. Stay with me until the end of this story and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Daniel's journey travels, because sometimes the person everyone underestimates is exactly the one who'll save them all. The train's whistle cut through the morning air like a knife through butter, sharp and final. It was the sound Larkspur, Colorado had heard 1,000 times before, the iron beast bringing mail, supplies, and occasionally hope. But on this particular May morning in 1886, it brought something else entirely. Daniel Crane, and with him, the beginning of a story that would change everything. Abigail Monroe stood on the platform, her hands twisting the fabric of her Sunday dress into wrinkled knots. The other dress, the one she'd married Thomas in 7 years ago, still hung in her wardrobe, but she couldn't bring herself to wear it today. That would have felt like a betrayal, even though Thomas had been dead for nearly 2 years now, taken by pneumonia one brutal winter that had seemed to last forever. The ranch needed a man. Her 7-year-old daughter Emma needed a father. And Abigail, though she'd never admitted aloud in this town, where weakness was currency you couldn't afford, needed someone to share the weight that had been crushing her shoulders since the day they'd lowered Thomas into the frozen ground. So she'd done what desperate women did on the frontier. She'd placed an advertisement. Widow with child in ranch seeks honest man for marriage. Must be God-fearing, hard-working, and of good character. Correspondence, welcome. 3 men had responded. 2 had seemed promising on paper, both claiming to be experienced ranchers, both writing in confident, sprawling handwriting about their abilities with livestock and land. Then there was Daniel Crane, whose letters were different. Neat, careful script. Words that talked about books and music and teaching children. He'd been honest about his lack of ranching experience, honest about coming from Boston, honest about being a school teacher who wanted a fresh start after his fiancée had died of scarlet fever. She'd chosen him anyway. Maybe because of the honesty. Maybe because his letters made her feel less alone. Or maybe, and this was the thought that kept her awake at night, because she'd made a terrible mistake. The train's brakes shrieked against metal, and the locomotive shuddered to a halt. Steam hissed from its sides like dragon's breath. Abigail watched as the conductor stepped down, then turned to help someone else descend. And there he was. Daniel Crane was tall, taller than she'd expected from his letters, which had mentioned nothing about his height. He was lanky in a way that suggested he'd never done a day of hard physical labor, his frame better suited to sitting at a desk than wielding an axe. He wore a dark suit that looked Eastern and out of place, and perched on his nose were wire-rimmed spectacles that caught the morning sun. But it was what he carried that made Abigail's heart sink into her stomach like a stone thrown into a well. A violin case. Not a rifle. Not tools. Not even a proper carpet bag filled with practical items. A violin. Jesus Christ, someone muttered behind her. Abigail didn't turn to see who'd spoken, but she recognized the voice. Frank Hollister, who owned the hardware store and had opinions about everything and everyone. That's what she ordered? That? Laughter rippled through the small crowd that had gathered. In a town like Larkspur, population barely 200, the arrival of anything new was entertainment. The arrival of a mail-order husband was a spectacle, and the arrival of this mail-order husband was apparently comedy. Daniel heard them. Abigail could tell by the slight hesitation in his step, the way his shoulders tensed for just a moment. But then he smiled, genuinely smiled, as if he'd been welcomed with open arms instead of open mockery. He spotted Abigail, she was the only woman standing alone on the platform after all, and approached with his hand extended. Mrs. Monroe? His voice was gentle, educated, with the rounded vowels of New England. I'm Daniel Crane. It's a pleasure to finally meet you in person. Up close she could see his eyes. Blue-gray, like storm clouds over the mountains. Kind eyes, but not weak ones. Something in their depths suggested he'd seen sorrow and survived it, which was perhaps the only truly valuable currency on the frontier. Mr. Crane? She shook his hand, aware of every eye watching them, every whisper being exchanged. Her cheeks burned with shame, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was ashamed of, choosing him or being embarrassed by her choice. Welcome to Larkspur. Thank you. He glanced around, taking in the rough wooden buildings, the dusty main street, the mountains rising in the distance like ancient guardians. It's beautiful here. Your letters didn't do it justice. Don't believe there's much beauty about it myself, came a rough voice. Sam Parker, one of the ranch hands who worked for the Peterson spread, stepped forward with a smirk playing on his weathered face. He was the kind of man the frontier seemed to breed, hard, lean, with eyes that had seen violence and dealt it out in equal measure. Beauty don't keep you alive out here. You know how to shoot that fiddle of yours, school teacher. More laughter. Daniel turned to face Sam, and for a moment, just a flash, Abigail saw something steel-hard flicker across his expression. But then the gentle smile returned. I'm afraid the violin makes a rather poor weapon, Mr. Parker. And yeah, I'd say so. But then, most everything about you seems poor for these parts. Sam looked Daniel up and down like he was evaluating livestock and finding it wanting. Mrs. Monroe, you sure you don't want to send this one back? My cousin Jim's been widowed 6 months now. He actually knows which end of a horse to feed. That's enough, Sam. Abigail's voice came out sharper than she'd intended. She was mortified, yes, but she was also angry at Sam for his cruelty, at the town for its judgment, and at herself for caring what any of them thought. Mr. Crane has traveled a long way. He's tired and hungry. We'll be going now. She didn't wait for Sam's response. She turned and started walking toward where she'd tied her wagon, praying that Daniel would follow and that her legs would continue supporting her weight. Behind her, she heard the violin case bumping against Daniel's leg as he hurried to catch up, heard the continued laughter and commentary from the platform. This is going to be good, someone said. How long you figure before he runs back east with his tail between his legs? I give him a week, another voice replied. First time he sees a rattler, he'll be done. A week? You're generous. I say 3 days. Their wagon was a practical affair, nothing fancy, just a flat bed with a bench seat and room for supplies in the back. Daniel loaded his trunk, a small battered thing that looked like it had seen better days, and climbed up beside her. He set the violin case carefully between them, treating it like something precious. Abigail snapped the reins and the horses started forward. They rode in silence through town, past the general store where Martha Jenkins stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, past the saloon where men were already drinking despite the early hour, past the church where Reverend Thomas, no relation to her late husband, was sweeping the steps. Everyone watched. Everyone had an opinion written on their face. It wasn't until they'd left the town proper behind, heading out onto the open prairie where the grass rolled away toward distant mountains, that Daniel finally spoke. I'm sorry. Abigail glanced at him sharply. For what? For embarrassing you. I understand that my presentation wasn't what you expected, or what they expected. He gestured vaguely back toward town. I should have been more explicit in my letters about my lack of practical frontier skills. You told me you were a school teacher from Boston. What exactly did I think that meant? The words came out bitter, and she immediately regretted them. None of this was his fault. He hadn't misrepresented himself. She'd simply hoped that somehow, against all logic, he'd be different in person, that the letters which had touched her heart would translate into a man who could also survive this brutal, beautiful land. You thought I might be more than I am, Daniel said quietly. It's all right. People often do. They rode on. The prairie stretched endlessly around them, dotted with scrub brush and the occasional cottonwood tree. A hawk circled overhead, riding thermals only it could feel. The sky was that particular shade of blue that only seemed to exist in the high country, deep and endless and somehow lonely despite its beauty. That's foolish, Abigail said finally. What is? People thinking you're more than you are. They should judge you by what you actually are, not what they imagine. Daniel smiled slightly. In my experience, people rarely do that. We're all constantly failing to live up to someone's imaginary version of us, or exceeding someone else's low expectations. The trick, I think, is to know who you actually are, regardless of what others think. And who are you, Mr. Crane? He considered this, adjusting his spectacles, a gesture she would come to recognize as something he did when thinking carefully. I'm a man who loved a woman and lost her. A man who realized that staying in Boston meant drowning in grief. A man who believes that education matters, that music matters, that kindness matters, even when those beliefs make him look foolish. And I'm a man who's willing to learn, Mrs. Monroe. I may not know how to brand cattle or shoot a rifle, but I can learn, if you're willing to teach me. Something in her chest loosened slightly. Not trust, not yet, but maybe the beginning of possibility. It's Abigail, she said. If we're to be married, you should call me Abigail. Abigail. He tested the name, and somehow it sounded different in his Boston accent. Softer. It's a beautiful name. Biblical. The wife of David, known for her wisdom. I don't feel very wise right now. Wisdom isn't about always making perfect choices, Daniel said. It's about making choices and then living with them honestly. The ranch came into view over the next rise, 150 acres that Thomas had carved out of the wilderness with his own hands, building the house board by board, fence post by fence post. It wasn't much. A small wooden house that desperately needed paint, a barn that leaned slightly to the left, a chicken coop, and fields where cattle grazed in the distance. But it had been theirs, and now it was hers, and soon it would be theirs again, though with a different them. Emma was sitting on the porch steps, waiting. She'd been waiting since dawn, too excited about meeting her new father to stay inside. When she saw the wagon approaching, she jumped up and ran toward them, her long brown braids flying behind her. "Mama! Mama! Is that him?" Abigail felt Daniel tense beside her and realized that this moment might be even harder for him than facing the mockery of the town. Thomas's daughter. Another man's child. A ready-made family that he was being asked to simply step into, as if grief could be packed away like seasonal clothing. "Yes, sweetheart. This is Mr. Crane." Daniel climbed down from the wagon before it had fully stopped, and to Abigail's surprise, he crouched down to Emma's level rather than towering over her. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. "Hello, Emma. Your mother has told me wonderful things about you in her letters. She says you're learning to read." Emma nodded shyly, suddenly overcome with the reality of this strange man. "Mama teaches me, but she says you're a real teacher, from a real school in a big city." "I was," Daniel agreed. "Would you like to show me around your home? I'm very new here, and I'm afraid I'll get lost without a proper guide." The little girl's face brightened. She grabbed his hand, so trusting, so willing to accept this stranger, and began pulling him toward the house. "First, I'll show you the chickens. I named them all. That one's Henrietta, and that one's Pearl, and that one's Trouble, because she keeps getting out." Abigail watched them go, her throat tight with emotions she couldn't name. Relief? Anxiety? Hope? Maybe all three at once, tangled together like thread knotted beyond repair. She unhitched the horses and led them to the barn, taking her time with the familiar tasks. Brush them down, check their hooves, make sure the water trough was full. Physical work that kept her hands busy and her mind from spinning too fast. When she finally walked back to the house, she could hear Emma's high, excited voice and Daniel's deeper one responding with what sounded like genuine interest. Inside, the house was simple. One main room that served as kitchen, dining room, and living area, with two smaller bedrooms off to the side. The furniture was handmade, rough but sturdy. Thomas's rifle still hung over the fireplace, a reminder of the man who was supposed to be here instead of Daniel. "Mama, Mr. Crane plays the violin. Can he play for us?" "Please?" Daniel looked uncertain. "Perhaps after dinner. I'm sure your mother has work to do, and I should help." "Nonsense," Abigail heard herself say, though she wasn't sure why. Maybe because Emma looked so hopeful. Maybe because she was curious. "We have a few minutes before I need to start cooking. Play something." Daniel retrieved the violin case from where he'd set it by the door and opened it carefully. The instrument inside was beautiful, dark wood polished to a shine, with an elegance that seemed almost offensive in this rough frontier house. He tucked it under his chin, raised the bow, and paused. What would you like to hear? Something happy, Emma said immediately. He played, and Abigail, who had expected something refined and boring, something suited for fancy Eastern parlors, was completely unprepared for what came out of that violin. It was a folk tune, lively and bright, the kind of music that made you want to tap your foot or spin in circles. Emma did exactly that, dancing around the room with unself-conscious joy while Daniel played, a small smile on his face as he watched her. When he finished, Emma clapped her hands. Again, play another one. After dinner, Abigail said firmly, though she found herself smiling too. Mr. Crane needs to wash up, and I need to cook. Emma, show him where the water pump is. As Emma dragged Daniel back outside, Abigail stood alone in her kitchen and tried to sort through the confusion of feelings in her chest. This wasn't what she'd expected. He wasn't what she'd expected. But maybe, just maybe, that wasn't entirely a bad thing. The next few days established a strange new rhythm. Daniel threw himself into learning ranch work with an earnestness that was almost painful to watch. He'd clearly never done manual labor before. His hands blistered after just an hour of splitting wood, and he held the axe with the awkward grip of someone who'd only read about it in books. But he didn't complain. Not once. Abigail showed him how to milk the cow, how to mend the fence where the wire had broken, how to check the cattle for signs of disease. He listened intently, asked questions, took notes in a small leather journal he kept in his pocket. The notes were sweet in their thoroughness. Wire must be taut but not too tight. Check for rust. Emma says the spotted cow is named Buttercup and has a gentle temperament. But while Daniel was earnest in his efforts, the rest of Larkspur found him endlessly amusing. On Sunday, they attended church together, their first public appearance as a married couple, though the actual wedding had been a quick, awkward ceremony performed by Reverend Thomas the evening Daniel arrived. The townspeople stared. Some whispered behind their hands. Others weren't subtle enough to bother hiding their comments. "Look at him," Mrs. Peterson said loudly enough for half the congregation to hear. "Hands softer than his own wife's, I'd wager." "Poor Abigail," Martha Jenkins added with false sympathy, "trading a real man for that." Daniel heard every word. Abigail could see it in the slight tightening around his eyes. But he simply guided her and Emma to their usual pew, with one hand lightly touching her elbow. When they sat, he opened the hymnal and sang in a clear, beautiful tenor that made several people turn around to stare. After the service, Sam Parker approached them in the churchyard. He'd been drinking. It was barely noon, but the smell of whiskey clung to him like cologne. "Crane," he said, putting too much emphasis on the name. "Some of the boys are having a shooting competition this afternoon. Entry fee's $1. Winner takes the pot. You interested?" It was a trap, obviously. Sam wanted to humiliate Daniel in front of the whole town. "Thank you for the invitation," Daniel said pleasantly, "but I'm afraid I'm not much of a shot. I'd be taking your money under false pretenses." "Oh, come on now." Sam's smile was mean. "Don't be modest. Surely a man's got to know how to protect his family. What if bandits came to your ranch? Or Indians? You gonna fight them off with that fiddle?" Several men had gathered now, sensing entertainment. Daniel looked at them, then back at Sam, and Abigail held her breath, waiting for him to either back down or rise to the bait. Instead, Daniel did something unexpected. "You're absolutely right," he said. "I should learn to shoot properly. Would you be willing to teach me? I'd pay for lessons, of course." The request was so genuine, so free of ego, that it diffused Sam's mockery like air escaping a balloon. The crowd that had gathered to watch a humiliation found themselves witnessing something else entirely. A man admitting weakness and asking for help. Sam blinked, clearly thrown. Well, I suppose I could." "Wonderful," Daniel said warmly. "Shall we say Tuesday afternoon? I have some money saved. Would $5 be fair compensation for your time?" $5 was generous, far more than shooting lessons warranted. Sam knew it. Everyone knew it. And suddenly Sam looked less like a bully and more like a man who'd been offered genuine work. "Tuesday works," he muttered. "Come to my place around 2. As they walked back to the wagon, Emma skipping ahead, Abigail leaned toward Daniel. "That was clever." "What was?" turning his mockery into an opportunity. Now he has to actually help you. Daniel smiled slightly. People are rarely as mean as they first appear. Usually they're just testing you, seeing if you'll react with anger or fear. When you react with openness instead, they don't know what to do with it. Is that a schoolteacher philosophy? It's a surviving childhood as a small boy with glasses philosophy, he said. Bullies want you to fight back or run away. Do neither, and they lose interest. But Larkspur's bullies didn't lose interest. If anything, Daniel's presence seemed to bring out the worst in certain elements of the town. Over the following weeks, the mockery continued. Men at the general store would fall silent when Daniel entered, then burst into laughter as soon as he left. Someone, probably Sam's younger brother Pete, left a child's toy gun on their porch with a note. For the shooter. At the town meeting, when Daniel suggested they repair the old bridge over Larkspur Creek before winter, Frank Hollister laughed in his face. The bridge has stood for 15 years, Frank said dismissively. I think it'll outlast your marriage, Crane. More laughter. Daniel's expression remained calm, but Abigail felt her own temper rising. These men were cruel in the casual way of people who'd never been challenged. They mocked Daniel for being different, for being gentle, for reading books instead of breaking horses. Even Abigail found herself questioning her decision. Late at night, lying in her small bedroom while Daniel slept in Thomas's old room, they'd agreed to take things slowly. She'd stare at the ceiling and wonder if she'd made a mistake. Daniel was kind. He was good with Emma. He tried so hard to learn everything she taught him, but kindness didn't fix fences. Goodness didn't protect against wolves. And trying hard wasn't the same as succeeding. One evening, about 3 weeks after Daniel's arrival, Abigail found him sitting on the porch steps in the twilight, playing his violin. The music was different this time, slower, sadder, full of longing. It was the sound of homesickness made audible. She sat down beside him, and he stopped playing. I'm sorry, he said. I didn't mean to disturb you. You didn't. She looked out at the prairie where the sun was setting in brilliant oranges and purples. That was beautiful, sad, but beautiful. It's called a Shokin farewell. It's about leaving home, about the ache of places you can't return to. He set the violin carefully in its case. I think of Boston sometimes, of my old school, my students, the life I had before your fiancée died. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Her name was Catherine. We were supposed to marry in the spring. She got sick in February. It started as a cough, nothing serious. By March, she was gone. I couldn't stay there anymore. Everything reminded me of her. The streets we'd walked, the park where I proposed, the church where we'd planned to wed. I thought coming west would help me escape the grief. And has it? No, he said honestly. Grief doesn't work like that. You can't outrun it. But perhaps I can learn to carry it differently, to make it part of something new instead of something that only points backward. Abigail understood that better than he knew. I think of Thomas every day. Sometimes I forget he's gone. I'll turn to tell him something, or I'll set out 4 plates instead of 3. The grief ambushes you when you least expect it. They sat in comfortable silence, 2 people bound by circumstances and letters and shared losses. Above them, stars were beginning to appear, more stars than anyone could count, spread across the sky like diamond dust. I know I'm not what you wanted, Daniel said finally. I know the town laughs at me, at us. And I know that you wonder sometimes if you made the wrong choice. Daniel, let me finish. He turned to face her, and in the fading light his eyes were serious. I may never be the kind of man Thomas was. I may never be strong enough or skilled enough or Western enough for this place. But I promise you this, Abigail, I will never stop trying. I will never stop learning. And I will never ever abandon you or Emma. Whatever I am, whatever I can give, it's yours. Something shifted in Abigail's chest, like ice breaking up on a river in early spring. She reached out and took his hand, his soft, blistered, scholarly hand, and held it. Then that will have to be enough, she said. The shooting lessons with Sam Parker became a regular Tuesday occurrence. True to his word, Daniel showed up at 2 o'clock sharp each week, money in hand, ready to learn. Sam, somewhat grudgingly at first, proved to be a decent teacher. He showed Daniel how to hold the rifle properly, how to sight down the barrel, how to squeeze the trigger instead of pulling it. Your problem is you think too much, Sam said one afternoon, watching Daniel miss the target for the 5th time in a row. You're trying to calculate the shot like it's mathematics. Just feel it. I'm a school teacher, Daniel replied mildly, reloading. Mathematics is how I understand the world. Well, the world out here don't care about your understanding. It just is. Now stop thinking and shoot. Daniel closed his eyes, took a breath, opened them, and fired. The bullet hit the edge of the target. Not a bullseye, but not a miss either. Sam actually grinned. There, see? Sometimes you gotta get out of your own head. Word spread that Daniel was taking shooting lessons, and the mockery evolved. Now people didn't just laugh at him for being useless. They laughed at him for trying to be useful and failing. But Daniel kept showing up, kept practicing, kept getting incrementally better. He applied the same stubborn patience to everything. The fence he mended held, even if it took him 3 times longer than it would have taken Thomas. The firewood he split was uneven, but it burned. He couldn't rope cattle, but he could calculate feed ratios. He couldn't track animals, but he could read almanacs and predict weather patterns. He wasn't the husband anyone expected, but slowly, so slowly that Abigail almost didn't notice it happening, he was becoming the husband they had. Emma adored him completely. Every evening after chores, Daniel would teach her lessons: reading, arithmetic, geography. He'd brought books with him from Boston, more books than Abigail had seen in her entire life, and he shared them with Emma like they were treasures, which Abigail supposed they were. Mr. Crane says I'm smart, Emma announced one evening at dinner. He says I could go to a real school someday, maybe even a university. Abigail caught Daniel's eye across the table. Universities were for rich people, for city folk, for anyone except ranchers' daughters in Colorado. But Daniel just smiled. If that's what you want, Emma, then we'll find a way. Don't fill her head with impossible dreams, Abigail said, more sharply than she'd intended. Why are they impossible? Daniel asked. Because she's a girl? Because she lives in Colorado? Because her family doesn't have money? Those are obstacles, not impossibilities. There's a difference. You don't understand how the world works. I understand exactly how the world works, he interrupted, and for the first time since he'd arrived, there was steel in his voice. I understand that it tells people like Emma, people like me, people like you, what we can't do and where we don't belong. And I understand that the only way anything ever changes is when people refuse to accept those limits. He stood up, took his plate to the sink, and walked outside. Through the window, Abigail watched him stand in the yard, hands in his pockets, looking up at the stars. Is Mr. Crane angry? Emma asked in a small voice. No, sweetheart. He's just passionate about things he believes in. I like that about him, Emma said. Papa Thomas was nice, but Mr. Crane makes me think maybe I could be more than just nice. That night, Abigail found Daniel sitting on the porch steps again, though without his violin this time. I'm sorry, she said, sitting beside him. You're right. I shouldn't limit her dreams. And I'm sorry for snapping. It's just, I spent my whole life being told what I couldn't do. Too weak, too bookish, too gentle. When Catherine died, people said I couldn't survive alone, couldn't start over, couldn't possibly make it out west. I'm tired of can't. So you came here to prove them wrong? No, he said. I came here to prove myself right. There's a difference. June arrived with thunderstorms that rolled across the prairie like freight trains, all flash and boom and fury. The creek swelled with runoff from the mountains. The bridge that Daniel had wanted to repair groaned under the pressure, but held, barely. At the next town meeting, Daniel brought it up again. We need to address the bridge, he said, standing in the small room above the general store where the town conducted its business. It's weakening. Another flood season like this, and it'll collapse. Frank Hollister rolled his eyes. The bridge is fine, Crane. Been there 15 years. Your fancy Boston education making you see problems that ain't there. I'm not imagining structural damage, Daniel said patiently. He pulled out his notebook, always that notebook, and flipped through pages. The support beams on the eastern side are rotting. You can see it from the bank. The center span is sagging approximately 8 inches below level, and after last week's storm, there's a crack in the main crossbeam. I sketched it if you'd like to see. Enough! Frank slapped his hand on the table. We ain't spending town money on a bridge that don't need fixing just because you're nervous. Why don't you head home and let your wife handle the real work while you play your fiddle? Laughter echoed through the room. Abigail, sitting in the back, felt her face burn. But Daniel didn't react with anger or embarrassment. He simply closed his notebook. I hope you're right, he said quietly. I truly do. The meetings continued without resolution. Summer deepened. Daniel's hands, once soft and unblistered, grew rough with calluses. His shooting improved to the point where Sam Parker actually complimented him. He learned to ride better, to work longer, to push through exhaustion in ways that surprised even Abigail. But the town's opinion didn't change. To Larkspur, he remained the joke, the gentle fool with his books and his violin and his educated words, the mail-order husband who didn't belong, the laughingstock who thought he could warn them about bridges. And then came the night everything changed. It started with rain. Not the gentle summer showers they'd been having, but something darker, more ominous. The sky turned green-black around 8 in the evening, and the temperature dropped so fast that Abigail could see her breath. Daniel stepped onto the porch and looked up at the clouds with an expression she'd never seen before, something between fear and recognition. We need to secure everything, he said urgently. The animals, the house, everything. This is going to be bad. It's just a storm. No. He turned to her, and his face was pale. I've seen weather like this before. When I was a boy in Boston, a hurricane came through. The sky looked exactly like this, that greenish color, the way the air feels heavy. Abigail, this isn't just a storm. Something in his tone made her believe him. They spent the next hour preparing, bringing the chickens into the barn, securing the shutters, moving everything inside that could blow away. Emma helped, caught up in the urgency without fully understanding it. By the time they finished, the first drops were starting to fall. They weren't normal drops. They were huge, heavy, hitting the ground with audible impacts. And they were cold, far too cold for June. Inside, Daniel ordered. Now. The storm hit like the wrath of God. The wind arrived first, howling like something alive and hungry. It tore across the prairie with such force that the house shuddered on its foundation, timbers groaning in protest. Rain followed immediately after, not falling so much as being hurled sideways, hammering against the walls with the sound of 1,000 fists pounding for entry. Lightning split the sky in jagged white lines, each flash illuminating the world outside for a frozen second before plunging everything back into darkness. Emma pressed herself against Abigail's side, trembling. Mama, I'm scared. I know, baby, I know. Abigail wrapped her arms around her daughter, but her own hands were shaking. She'd seen storms before, violent summer tempests that rolled down from the mountains without warning, but nothing like this. This felt apocalyptic, biblical, like the world itself was being unmade. Daniel moved through the house methodically, checking windows, wedging furniture against doors, his face set in concentration. The fear she'd seen on the porch was gone now, replaced by something else. Purpose, maybe. Or just the particular calm that came from having no choice but to act. The barn, Abigail said suddenly, shouting to be heard over the storm. The animals, they'll be fine. The barn's sturdy. Daniel pulled the curtain aside to peer out, and his face went pale in the lightning flash. But that shed where you keep the tools isn't. It's already starting to lean. Even as he said it, there was a tremendous crack. Through the window, they watched the tool shed simply lift off the ground like a toy, tumble twice in the air, and crash into pieces against the fence line. Tools that Thomas had carefully collected over years, saws, hammers, the good axe, scattered across the prairie like seeds. Jesus, Abigail whispered. The storm raged for an hour, then 2. Rain came in sheets so thick that looking outside was like staring into a waterfall. The creek, which ran along the eastern edge of their property, was audible even over the wind, a deep, threatening roar that grew louder by the minute. Thunder cracked so close that Emma screamed and even Abigail flinched. Daniel sat with them on the floor, away from the windows, one arm around Emma and his free hand holding Abigail's. His grip was steady despite the chaos, his voice calm when he spoke. "It's going to pass," he said. "All storms do. We just need to wait it out." "You said you'd seen weather like this before," Abigail said. "In Boston. When I was 10. A hurricane came up the coast, tore roofs off buildings, flooded streets, killed 17 people in the city." His voice was matter-of-fact, but his hand tightened slightly on hers. "My father made us shelter in the cellar. We stayed down there for 6 hours, listening to the world end above us. But it didn't end. The storm passed. The sun came back. Life went on." "Were you scared?" "Terrified. But my father told me something that day that I've never forgotten. He said fear is just your body's way of making sure you pay attention. It's not the enemy. Panic is the enemy." Lightning flashed again, so bright it left after-images dancing across Abigail's vision. In that moment of illumination, she saw something that made her heart stop. Water. Not just puddles or runoff, but water rising across their land like a living thing, spreading from the direction of the creek. It was already past the barn, lapping at the chicken coop, reaching toward the house with inexorable patience. "Daniel?" Her voice came out strangled. "The creek is flooding." He looked out the window, saw what she'd seen, and his calm finally cracked. "How high is this house above the creek bed?" "Maybe 10 feet? 12? She tried to remember, tried to picture the slope of the land. "Thomas always said we were safe from floods because 12 feet isn't enough," Daniel said. "Not if this keeps up. We need to be ready to move to higher ground." "There is no higher ground? The nearest hill is 2 miles away and we can't travel in this." Daniel stood, began pacing, thinking. She could almost see his mind working, calculating, analyzing. "The church," he said finally. "The church is on the highest point in town, and it's built on a stone foundation. If we have to evacuate, that's where we go." "We can't go anywhere in this weather. We'd never make it." "Then we pray the rain stops." He went back to the window, watching the water's progress with intense focus. "And we prepare in case it doesn't." He moved through the house, gathering supplies with surprising efficiency. Blankets, food that wouldn't spoil, matches in a waterproof tin, rope, his medical bag. Abigail had forgotten he'd brought one. Relics from when he'd served as a school nurse as well as a teacher. He packed everything into a canvas bag, tied it shut, and set it by the door. "Abigail, can you swim?" The question caught her off guard. "A little. Thomas taught me in the creek during summers. Why?" "Emma?" "No, she's afraid of the water." Daniel's jaw tightened. "If we have to evacuate and the water's too high, I'll carry her. You stay close to me. Hold on to my belt or my coat. Understand? Don't let go no matter what." "You're scaring me." "Good," he said bluntly. "You should be scared. Fear makes you careful. But don't panic. Can you do that? Can you stay calm for Emma?" Abigail looked at her daughter, who was watching them with wide, frightened eyes. She thought of every time Thomas had told her she was strong, every moment she'd had to be strong after he died, every dawn she'd woken up and forced herself to keep going. She drew on all of that now. "Yes," she said, "I can." The water continued to rise. Within another hour, it had reached the porch steps, dark and swift-moving and full of debris, branches, fence posts, unidentifiable objects tumbling past in the current. The rain showed no sign of stopping. If anything, it seemed to be intensifying, driven by wind that now sounded like a freight train bearing down on them. Daniel stood at the window, his reflection pale in the glass. "We need to go," he said. "Now, while we still can. The barn, the animals. We'll have to fend for themselves. I'm not risking our lives for livestock." His voice was firm, allowing no argument. "Get Emma's coat. The heavy one. We're leaving." They prepared quickly, hands shaking with adrenaline and fear. Daniel tied the supply bag to his back, then fashioned a rope around his waist with the other end looped around Abigail. "This way, if one of us falls, we're still connected. Emma, I need you to climb onto my back and hold on as tight as you can, all right?" "I'm scared," Emma whispered. "I know, so am I, but we're going to be brave together." He crouched down so she could climb on, her small arms wrapping around his neck, her legs around his waist. "That's good. Now don't let go no matter what happens. Can you do that for me?" "I'll try." "Not try, do." His voice was gentle but absolute. "Promise me, Emma." "I promise." Daniel looked at Abigail, and in his eyes she saw not the laughingstock of Larkspur, not the gentle fool everyone mocked, but someone else entirely. Someone who knew exactly what he was doing because he'd survived this before. "Stay close," he said. "If the current catches you, don't fight it. Go with it until you can angle towards safety. And if we get separated, we won't. If we do, go to the church. Wait for us there. Understand?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. Daniel opened the door. The storm roared in like a living thing, wind and rain and the deep bellow of rushing water. The porch was already submerged, the steps invisible beneath the flood. In the lightning flashes, Abigail could see the world transformed into something alien and terrifying, their familiar land now an endless expanse of dark water stretching toward town. "Step where I step," Daniel shouted over the wind. "Test your footing before you put your weight down. Ready?" She wasn't. She'd never be ready. But she nodded anyway, and they stepped out into the storm. The water was shockingly cold and moving fast, tugging at her legs with insistent pressure. Within 3 steps, it was up to her thighs. Daniel moved ahead of her, each step careful and deliberate, Emma clinging to his back. The rope between them grew taut, then slack, then taut again as they navigated the submerged landscape. Something large, a piece of the fence maybe, or part of someone's roof, came rushing toward them out of the darkness. Daniel saw it just in time, grabbed Abigail and pulled her aside. The debris smashed past them so close she could have touched it, spinning away into the night. "Keep moving," Daniel urged. "Don't stop." They pushed forward. Abigail's legs burned with the effort of walking through the current. Her dress, heavy with water, tangled around her ankles. She tried to gather it up with one hand while keeping the other on the rope that connected her to Daniel, but it was like fighting a living thing that wanted to drag her down. The town came into view in stages, revealed by lightning flashes like scenes in a magic lantern show. And what Abigail saw made her stomach drop. Larkspur was drowning. Main Street was a river. Water poured between buildings, carrying with it everything that hadn't been secured. Barrels, chairs, a child's wagon spinning crazily in the current. The general store's windows had shattered, and she could see supplies washing out through the broken glass. Someone's horse struggled past, wild-eyed and desperate, fighting to keep its head above water. And everywhere, people. They emerged from houses and shops in various stages of panic, some trying to save possessions, others just trying to save themselves. Abigail recognized Martha Jenkins standing in the door of her dress shop, screaming something that was lost in the storm. The Peterson boys, Frank Hollister, Reverend Thomas, all of them caught in the same nightmare, all of them suddenly equal in their terror. "The church!" someone shouted. "Everyone to the church!" Daniel was already moving that direction, pulling Abigail along. Other people fell in beside them, a ragged procession struggling through the flood toward the one building that seemed to offer safety. Sam Parker appeared out of the darkness with his wife and 2 children. Frank Hollister, humbled and terrified. The widow Mrs. Chen, who ran the boarding house, supporting an elderly man who could barely walk. They were halfway to the church when the sound changed. It started as a deep groan, like the earth itself was in pain. Then came a tremendous crack that echoed across the valley despite the storm. Abigail turned just in time to see something that would haunt her nightmares for years to come. The bridge Daniel had warned them about, the bridge Frank had dismissed as fine, didn't just break. It exploded. The main span, weakened by rot and battered by the flood, simply gave way. Massive timbers that had held for 15 years snapped like kindling. The entire structure collapsed into the raging water with a sound like a cannon blast, and suddenly there was nothing but the flood. No barrier at all between the swollen creek and the town. The water's character changed instantly. What had been merely dangerous became deadly. A wall of water, released by the bridge's destruction, came roaring downstream with the force of 1,000 horses. It slammed into buildings on the eastern edge of town, and Abigail watched in horror as the blacksmith's shop simply disappeared, swept away like it had never existed. "Run!" Daniel screamed. "Everyone run!" They ran, or tried to. Running in chest-deep water was like running in a nightmare where your legs won't move fast enough. The wave bore down on them, a dark wall visible even in the storm's darkness. Abigail could hear people screaming, could hear the roar of destruction, could feel the current suddenly triple in strength, yanking at her legs. She went down. The water closed over her head, cold and chaotic, and filled with debris. She tumbled, lost all sense of direction, didn't know which way was up. Her lungs burned. Her hands scrabbled for purchase on anything, found nothing but water and darkness and terror. Then the rope around her waist went taut, and she was being pulled. She broke the surface, gasping, choking, and found Daniel somehow still standing, somehow still holding Emma with one arm while he'd hauled Abigail up with the other, the muscles in his neck standing out with the effort. "I've got you," he said, and despite everything, the storm, the flood, the screaming chaos around them, his voice was steady. "I've got you both. Don't let go." They reached the church just as the full force of the flood hit Main Street. The building stood on its stone foundation like an island in the surge, water swirling around it but unable to reach the doors. People crowded up the steps and through the entrance in a desperate press of bodies. Daniel pushed Abigail and Emma ahead of him, making sure they were safe inside before he turned back. "Wait!" Abigail gasped. "What are you doing? There are still people out there." Before she could stop him, he plunged back into the water. And suddenly, the man everyone had mocked was the one running toward danger while others ran away. He fought his way through the current toward a woman struggling to keep her head above water, grabbed her around the waist, and dragged her toward the church. Hands reached out from the doorway to pull her inside. Daniel went back out again. This time he helped an elderly couple, moving with them at their slow pace, patient even as the water rose higher. Back again for Sam Parker's youngest son, who'd gotten separated from his family. Back again for someone's dog, of all things, because a little girl was screaming for her pet, and Daniel couldn't stand it. Each trip was suicide. Each time he went out, Abigail was certain he wouldn't come back. But each time, he did. Soaked, exhausted, sometimes bleeding from scrapes she couldn't identify, but alive and already scanning the water for the next person who needed help. Other men, shamed by his example or inspired by it or simply realizing they needed his help, began joining him. Sam Parker, who taught Daniel to shoot. Frank Hollister, who'd mocked him in the town meeting. Young Pete Parker, barely 18. They formed a chain, passing people along from one set of hands to another, working together in ways the town never had before. Inside the church, Abigail tried to help where she could. She wrapped people in blankets, checked for injuries, tried to calm hysterical children. Emma, somehow, had found her courage. She moved among the younger kids, holding hands, singing soft songs Daniel had taught her. Reverend Thomas organized supplies, taking inventory of what they had and what they'd need if the storm didn't end soon. The church filled. 30 people, 40, 50, more. The whole town, or what remained of it, packed into the small wooden building that suddenly seemed like Noah's Ark, the only solid thing left in a world of water. And still, Daniel kept going out. "Someone needs to stop him," Martha Jenkins said, watching through the window. "He's going to get himself killed." But no one stopped him, maybe because they knew he wouldn't listen. Or maybe because they'd finally realized what Abigail had seen that first day on the train platform. There was steel beneath Daniel's gentleness, strength that ran deeper than muscle. It was nearly midnight when he finally came inside, not because there was no one left to save, but because there was no one left to find. The ones who hadn't made it to the church. Well, they'd either found shelter elsewhere or they were gone. Daniel collapsed against the wall just inside the door, his chest heaving, his spectacles gone, lost somewhere in the flood, his face pale beneath the mud and water. Abigail pushed through the crowd to reach him. "You fool," she said, but her voice broke on the words. "You stupid, brave fool." "Everyone here?" he asked between gasps. "Everyone we could find." He nodded, closed his eyes. "Good, that's good." "Mr. Crane?" It was Sam Parker, standing awkwardly with his hat in his hands. "I just wanted to say, what you did out there, that took guts. Real guts. I was wrong about you." Daniel opened his eyes, looked at Sam with an expression Abigail couldn't quite read. "You weren't wrong. I was never going to be the man you expected. But maybe that's not what you needed anyway." Before Sam could respond, someone else pushed forward. Frank Hollister, his usual bluster completely gone, his face haggard. "The bridge," he said hoarsely. "You tried to warn us. I didn't listen. All those people whose homes are destroyed now, that's on me." "No," Daniel said firmly. "The storm is on the storm. You made a mistake, Frank. We all make mistakes. What matters is what we do next." The wind continued to howl outside, but inside the church, something had shifted. The way people looked at Daniel was different now, not with mockery or pity or confusion, but with something else. Respect, maybe, or recognition. Hours passed in strange suspension. The storm raged on, seemingly endless. People huddled together for warmth, sharing blankets and quiet conversation. Children slept fitfully in their parents' arms. Elderly folks dozed, sitting up. The Reverend led prayers, his voice a steady anchor in the chaos. Daniel sat with Abigail and Emma, all three of them wrapped in a single blanket. Emma had finally fallen asleep, her head on Daniel's shoulder, exhausted by fear and adrenaline. Abigail found herself studying his profile in the dim lamplight. This man she'd ordered from an advertisement, this stranger she'd married, this person she'd been so unsure about. "You saved a lot of people tonight," she said quietly. "We saved people. Sam, Frank, the others. They did as much as I did. They followed your lead. You went first." He was quiet for a moment. "In Boston, during that hurricane, a man died saving my little sister. He was our neighbor, a dock worker named Murphy. Big man, strong, everything I wasn't. When our house started to flood, he came over and helped my family evacuate. My sister Catherine, not the Catherine I was engaged to, my sister, she slipped in the water. Murphy grabbed her, got her to safety, but he was swept away in the process. They found his body 3 days later. I'm sorry. I was 10 years old, and I watched him die being brave. I remember thinking that's what real strength looks like. Not muscle or swagger or being able to fight. Real strength is moving toward danger when everyone else is running away. Real strength is doing what's right, even when it's terrifying. Real strength is..." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Real strength is caring more about someone else's safety than your own." Is that why you became a teacher, to be strong in that way? Maybe. I don't know. I just knew I didn't want Murphy's death to be meaningless. If he could be brave for us, I could be brave for others, even if it looked different than what people expected. Thunder cracked overhead, but it sounded more distant now. The rain, while still heavy, had lost some of its earlier fury. People began to notice, to whisper hopefully, that maybe, finally, the worst was over. Daniel stood carefully, extracting himself from Emma without waking her, and moved to the window. Abigail followed. Outside, the water was still high, but no longer rising. The worst of the debris had passed. The eastern sky, while still dark, showed the faintest hint of something that wasn't quite lightning, the promise of dawn, hours away, but coming. "We survived," Abigail said. "We survived," Daniel agreed. "But tomorrow the real work begins. The town is destroyed. People have lost everything. There'll be bodies to find, homes to rebuild, grief to process. This was just the first part. And you'll help them rebuild." It wasn't a question, but he answered anyway. "Of course, that's what you do. You survive the disaster and then you help each other survive what comes after." He was right. Even as the storm finally began to break around 3 in the morning, even as the rain slowed to a drizzle and then stopped entirely, the magnitude of what had happened became clear. When dawn arrived, gray and cold and merciless, it revealed a town that had been fundamentally transformed. Main Street was a devastated mess of mud and debris. Buildings had collapsed or been swept away entirely. The bridge was completely gone, not even rubble remaining to mark where it had stood. The creek had carved a new channel through the eastern part of town, wiping out 5 homes and the livery stable. Bodies would be found in the days to come. 8 people who hadn't made it to safety, including old Mr. Henderson who'd refused to leave his shop. But as the survivors emerged from the church into that gray morning, there was something else besides the destruction. There was also the awareness that they'd survived together, that when everything fell apart, they'd held together, and that the man they'd all dismissed as useless, weak, too gentle for the frontier had been the one to lead them through the darkness. Daniel stood on the church steps, surveying the damage with Emma holding one hand and Abigail holding the other. His clothes were still wet, his face exhausted, his usual gentle smile replaced with something more serious. Around him, townspeople gathered, not laughing anymore, not mocking, but waiting to see what the man they'd underestimated would do next. Sam Parker was the first to speak. "Crane, Daniel, what do we do?" And in that moment, in that simple question, everything changed, because it wasn't asked with sarcasm or challenge. It was asked with genuine need, with the assumption that Daniel would know, that Daniel would help, that Daniel could be trusted. Daniel looked at Sam, then at Frank, then at all the others watching him. He took a breath, squared his shoulders, and became something he'd never planned to be, the person they'd all needed him to become. "First," he said, his voice carrying across the crowd with unexpected authority, "we check for survivors. Form groups of 3 or 4. Search every building that's still standing, call out, listen for responses. Sam, you take the northern section. Frank, you take the south. Reverend, coordinate from here. This is our central point. Everyone reports back within 2 hours." People moved immediately, organizing themselves, following his directions without question. "Second," Daniel continued, "we need clean water. The creek is contaminated now. There's going to be disease if we're not careful." "Mrs. Chen, didn't you tell me you had a spring on your property? We'll need to set up water collection there. Third, we need shelter. Anyone whose home is destroyed can stay here in the church temporarily. We'll organize supplies, ration what we have, and figure out long-term solutions after we've handled the immediate crisis." He kept talking, his mind clearly working through logistics with the same methodical precision he'd once applied to lesson plans and arithmetic problems. People listened. People took notes. People, for the first time since he'd arrived, treated Daniel Crane not as a joke, but as exactly what he was. Someone who knew how to think clearly in chaos. Someone who could organize and plan and lead. Abigail felt something swell in her chest that might have been pride, or might have been love, or might have been just the overwhelming relief of realizing she hadn't made a mistake after all. This man, her husband, her partner, her choice, was exactly who she'd needed him to be. Not despite being different from what everyone expected, but because of it. The sun broke through the clouds around noon, and with it came the hard truth of what they'd lost and what they'd have to rebuild. But also, walking through the muddy ruins of Larkspur beside Daniel as he helped organize rescue efforts, directed reconstruction, and offered comfort to the grieving, Abigail Monroe understood something fundamental. Sometimes the person everyone laughs at becomes the person everyone needs. Sometimes gentleness is stronger than force. Sometimes the mail-order husband who arrives with a violin instead of a rifle turns out to be exactly the right man for the moment. And sometimes trust isn't something you give immediately. Sometimes it's something you earn, slowly and painfully, one brave act at a time, until the day comes when everyone realizes they've already given it without even noticing. That day had come for Larkspur. The laughingstock had become the leader. The fool had become the wise man. And Daniel Crane, who'd stepped off that train 3 months ago to mockery and doubt, stood in the ruins of a Colorado town and began the work of rebuilding not just buildings, but also something far more important, a community that had learned finally what true strength looked like. The first body they found was old Mr. Henderson, still clutching the ledger from his shop, as if numbers and records could save him from the flood. Sam Parker and Frank Hollister carried him to the church on a makeshift stretcher, their faces gray with the weight of death. Daniel met them at the steps, and without hesitation, he helped them lay the old man down with a gentleness that seemed almost sacred. "He has a daughter in Denver," Daniel said quietly, kneeling beside the body. "Someone needs to send word, and we need to keep a record, name, where he was found, anything that might help his family later." "You know about his daughter?" Frank asked, surprised. "He told me. 2 weeks ago, when I was at his shop buying nails. We talked for nearly an hour." Daniel stood, brushing mud from his knees. "Everyone has a story, Frank. Everyone matters. We need to treat these deaths with the dignity they deserve." By midday, they'd found 3 more bodies. Mrs. Patterson, who'd lived alone on the eastern edge of town. The Morrison twins, just 14 years old, who'd apparently tried to save their family's horses and been swept away. Each discovery brought fresh grief, fresh tears from those who'd known them. And each time, Daniel was there, recording names, offering quiet words of comfort, helping to carry the deceased to the makeshift morgue they'd set up in the church cellar. It was grim work, the kind that wore on the soul as much as the body, but Daniel moved through it with a steady presence that seemed to anchor everyone else. He didn't shy away from the difficult moments, didn't flinch when Martha Jenkins broke down sobbing over Mrs. Patterson's body, didn't hesitate when young Pete Parker vomited after finding the Morrison twins. He simply held space for the grief, acknowledged it, and then gently guided people back to the work that still needed doing. "How does he do it?" Martha asked Abigail that afternoon. They were in the church kitchen, such as it was, trying to organize the meager food supplies into something resembling meals. "I've known death before. My husband passed 3 years ago, but this feels different, bigger, and yet Daniel just keeps going, calm as anything." Abigail thought about what Daniel had told her the night before, about the man who'd saved his sister during the hurricane. "I think he learned a long time ago that grief doesn't stop needing you. You can fall apart later. First, you do what needs doing." "Still," Martha said, and there was something like wonder in her voice, "I was wrong about him. We all were. The way he went out into that water last night, pulling people to safety. I keep thinking about how we mocked him, how I mocked him. God forgive me." "He already has," Abigail said. "That's not something Daniel holds on to. Grudges, I mean." By evening, they'd completed the initial search. 8 dead in total. A tragedy, but not the massacre it could have been if people hadn't made it to the church. 32 buildings destroyed or damaged beyond immediate use. The bridge completely gone. Livestock scattered or drowned. Gardens washed away. The creek's new channel had fundamentally changed the town's geography, cutting through what had been Pete Parker's family land and leaving a 20-foot gorge where flat ground used to be. Daniel called a meeting in the church as the sun set, painting the ruined town in shades of orange and gold that seemed almost obscene in their beauty. Nearly everyone who'd survived was there, packed into the pews or standing along the walls. Emma sat in the front row beside Abigail, her small hand gripping her mother's tightly. "I know you're all exhausted," Daniel began, standing at the front near the pulpit. Reverend Thomas had offered it to him, but Daniel had refused. This wasn't a sermon, just a conversation. "I know you're grieving. I know you're scared about what comes next. Those are all reasonable, human responses to what we've been through. But we don't have the luxury of time to process everything right now. We need to make decisions, and we need to make them together." "What kind of decisions?" someone called out. "Survival decisions. We have maybe 3 days of food if we're careful. We have clean water from Mrs. Chen's spring, but it's a half-mile walk each way. We have shelter for everyone in the church, but it's crowded and won't be sustainable for more than a few weeks. We have winter coming in 4 months, and most of the homes that people relied on are gone. We need a plan." Frank Hollister stood up, his face haggard, but his voice steady. "Before we talk about plans, I need to say something." He turned to face the crowd. "The bridge. Daniel warned us it needed repair. I dismissed him, called him nervous, said he was seeing problems that weren't there. If I'd listened, if we'd all listened, maybe we could have reinforced it. Maybe it wouldn't have collapsed. Maybe those 8 people would still be alive." The silence that followed was heavy with shared guilt, because Frank was right, and everyone knew it. They'd all dismissed Daniel's warnings. They'd all chosen to ignore the gentle Eastern schoolteacher who didn't fit their idea of what frontier wisdom looked like. "Frank," Daniel said quietly, "you made a decision based on the best information you had at the time. Yes, it was the wrong decision. Yes, there are consequences we all have to live with. But blame won't rebuild the bridge or bring anyone back. What matters now is that we listen to each other going forward, all voices, even the uncomfortable ones, especially the uncomfortable ones." "So what do we do?" Sam Parker asked. "You seem to have ideas. We're listening now." Daniel pulled out his notebook, the same one he'd been carrying since he arrived, now water-stained but still legible. "I've been making notes. First, immediate needs: food, water, shelter, sanitation. Second, short-term needs: rebuilding critical infrastructure like the bridge, securing shelter before winter, establishing supply lines. Third, long-term needs: economic recovery, population stability, protection against future disasters." He began outlining his thoughts, and Abigail watched as the town that had mocked her husband for his careful note-taking now leaned forward to hear every word. He suggested sending riders to Denver to request emergency supplies and assistance. He proposed organizing work crews to clear debris and salvage what could be saved. He talked about building a temporary bridge using timber from the destroyed buildings, reinforcing it with a design he'd seen in Boston that could withstand flooding better than the old structure. Where'd you learn about bridge design? Pete Parker asked, genuinely curious. Books, mostly, Daniel admitted, and I spent a summer during university working with civil engineers. I was terrible at the manual labor part, but I was good at understanding the principles. Force distribution, load bearing, how water flow affects structural integrity. I never thought I'd actually use any of it. Funny how things work out, Sam said, and there was no mockery in his voice. Guess all that book learning has practical uses after all. The meeting stretched late into the night, with people asking questions, offering ideas, debating solutions. Daniel facilitated rather than dictated, drawing out opinions from people who'd rarely been asked for them. Mrs. Chen, it turned out, had ideas about water conservation from her childhood in China. Young Pete had been studying modern farming techniques through a correspondence course and had thoughts about replanting the destroyed gardens. Even Emma contributed, suggesting they organize the younger children to help collect debris, making them feel useful instead of scared. By the time they finished, they had something resembling a plan. It wasn't perfect, nothing about this situation could be perfect, but it was a start, a framework they could build on, adjust as needed, refine through trial and error. As people filed out to return to their makeshift sleeping spots throughout the church, Sam approached Daniel with his hat in his hands again, a gesture that was becoming habitual, as if the flood had washed away his swagger and left something more humble behind. I wanted to apologize, Sam said. Properly, I mean. When you first got here, I gave you hell, made jokes at your expense, called you weak and useless and a whole lot worse when you weren't around to hear it. And then last night, you saved my youngest boy, went out into water that could have killed you and brought him back. I don't. His voice broke. Daniel put a hand on his shoulder. You don't need to say anything, Sam. You've already apologized by listening, by helping today, by treating me like someone worth hearing. That's enough. Is it though? Because I keep thinking about Tommy, my boy, and how if you hadn't been here, if Abigail had picked someone else from those letters, he'd be dead right now. And I mocked the man who saved him. What kind of person does that make me? Human, Daniel said simply. Flawed and human, just like the rest of us. You made assumptions based on appearances. It's what people do. But you're changing those assumptions now, and that's what matters. Sam nodded, not entirely convinced, but willing to accept the grace being offered. The shooting lessons, he said. I'd like to keep doing those. Not because you need to prove anything, but because I like teaching you. Turns out you're not half bad when you stop overthinking. I'd like that too. After Sam left, Abigail found Daniel sitting alone in one of the pews, his head bowed. She thought at first he might be praying, but when she sat beside him, she saw his hands were shaking. Daniel? I'm fine, he said automatically, then stopped himself. No, that's not true. I'm not fine. I'm exhausted and overwhelmed and terrified that I'm going to let all these people down. They're looking to me for leadership, Abigail, and I'm just a school teacher who's good at organizing lesson plans. What if I make the wrong call? What if someone else dies because I didn't see something I should have seen? She took his shaking hands in hers. Then we'll deal with it together. You're not alone in this, Daniel. You never were. Look around. You've got Sam and Frank and Reverend Thomas and me and everyone else. We're all in this together now. I keep thinking about Murphy, he said softly. The man who saved my sister, how he looked so calm going into danger, like he wasn't afraid at all. I always thought that's what bravery looked like. But I was terrified last night. Every time I went into that water, I was certain I wasn't coming back. And yet you went anyway. That's not the absence of fear, Daniel. That's courage despite fear. There's a difference. He looked at her, really looked at her, and something in his expression shifted. How did I get so lucky? To find you, I mean. Of all the advertisements I could have answered, all the women I could have written to, somehow I found the one person who sees me clearly and doesn't wish I was someone else. Maybe it wasn't luck, Abigail said. Maybe it was just right. two broken people finding each other at exactly the moment they both needed saving. Are you less broken now? She considered the question honestly. I'm differently broken. The sharp edges have worn down a bit. There's space for something new to grow. What about you? I think I'm learning that I don't have to be Catherine, or Murphy, or Thomas, or anyone else people expect me to be. I can just be Daniel, and maybe that's enough. It's more than enough, she said, and kissed him, the first real kiss they'd shared since that awkward wedding ceremony 3 months ago. It was tender and exhausted and tasted like mud and hope in equal measure. The next week was a blur of constant work. They organized salvage crews that picked through ruined buildings, sorting what could be saved from what had to be discarded. They established a water distribution system, with volunteers making regular trips to Mrs. Chen's spring. They set up a communal kitchen in the church, pooling resources and preparing simple meals that stretched their limited supplies as far as possible. Daniel was everywhere at once, it seemed. In the mornings, he'd be helping clear debris, his scholar's hands now blistered and scarred from manual labor. In the afternoons, he'd be working on the temporary bridge design, making calculations and sketches while Sam and Frank looked over his shoulder, offering practical insights. In the evenings, he'd teach lessons to the children, because education couldn't stop just because the world had ended, and the kids needed normalcy as much as they needed food. And somehow, in between all of that, he found time to sit with the grieving. He spent an hour with old Mrs. Patterson's sister, who'd come from Denver to claim the body, just listening to stories about the woman he'd barely known. He helped the Morrison family plan a memorial service for the twins. He wrote letters to distant relatives on behalf of those who'd lost loved ones, his careful handwriting turning tragedy into words that might offer some small comfort. "You're going to burn yourself out," Abigail told him one night, watching him fall asleep mid-sentence while reviewing supply inventories. "Can't stop," he mumbled. Too much to do. The town survived for decades before you got here. It'll manage if you rest for 8 hours." But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't entirely true. The town had survived, yes, but it had never thrived. It had simply existed, a collection of individuals all struggling separately through the harsh frontier life. What Daniel was building now, or helping them build, was something different. A real community, bound together by shared trauma and shared purpose. The writers they'd sent to Denver returned with unexpected news. The territorial governor, hearing about the flood, had authorized emergency funds for Larkspur's reconstruction. Not a fortune, but enough to buy lumber, tools, and supplies. Even more surprisingly, 3 newspapers in Denver had run stories about the disaster, and donations were pouring in from strangers who'd been moved by accounts of the town's survival. "Look at this," Reverend Thomas said, spreading out a copy of the Rocky Mountain News on the church table. They interviewed some of the writers. Listen to what Sam told them. "We would have lost half the town if not for Daniel Crane. He organized the rescue, got people to safety, and now he's leading the rebuilding. Man's a hero." Daniel, reading over the Reverend's shoulder, went pale. "I'm not a hero. I just did what anyone would." "But anyone didn't," Frank interrupted. "You did. And Sam's right. We'd have lost a lot more people if you hadn't known what to do. So get used to it, Crane. You're a hero whether you like it or not." The attention made Daniel visibly uncomfortable, but it had practical benefits. More donations arrived. Volunteers from neighboring towns came to help with reconstruction. A civil engineer from Denver showed up offering to consult on the bridge design free of charge. When he saw Daniel's sketches, he actually whistled in appreciation. "This is good work," the engineer said. "Really good. Where'd you learn this?" "Books, mostly, and some practical observation during a summer internship." "Well, your books taught you well. This design would work, and it'd be stronger than what you had before. You considered using stone pilings instead of wooden posts? Would last longer, handle flooding better." "I thought about it, but stone's expensive and we'd need skilled masons." "I know some people. Let me make some inquiries. Might be able to get materials donated if I can sell them on the story." And so the bridge began to rise again, this time built properly. Stone pilings anchored deep into the creek bed, timber beams designed to flex with water pressure rather than resist it. Cross-bracing that distributed weight evenly. Daniel worked alongside the construction crews, his theoretical knowledge combined with Sam's practical experience, creating something that neither could have built alone. The town changed as they worked. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the mockery that had defined Daniel's first months in Larkspur faded away. People stopped making jokes about the mail-order husband with his violin and his books. Instead, they started asking his opinion on things. Should they rebuild the school in the same location or move it to higher ground? What was the best way to prevent contamination of the water supply? How should they organize shifts for the communal kitchen? Daniel answered every question thoughtfully, never pretending to know more than he did, always willing to say, "I don't know, but let's figure it out together." And in that humility, that willingness to learn alongside people rather than talk down to them, he earned something more valuable than respect. He earned trust. Emma flourished under his attention. She'd started calling him Papa Daniel, not replacing her father, but adding a new father to her heart. He taught her advanced arithmetic, geography, Latin. He encouraged her natural curiosity, answering her endless questions with patience even when he was exhausted. When she asked why the flood happened, he didn't give her simple platitudes about God's will. He explained about weather patterns, topography, how human choices like poor bridge maintenance contributed to natural disasters. "So it's not that God was angry?" she asked. "I don't think so, sweetheart. I think it's just that water follows laws of physics, and sometimes those laws create tragedy. But that doesn't mean there's no meaning in it. Sometimes the meaning comes from how people respond, how they help each other, how they rebuild. Like you helped everyone." "Like everyone helped each other," he corrected gently. "I just organized it a bit." But Emma's perspective wasn't unique. The children of Larkspur all seemed drawn to Daniel in ways that surprised their parents. Maybe it was because he talked to them like they were people, not miniatures. Maybe it was because he made learning interesting, turning arithmetic into games and history into stories. Or maybe it was simply that children, with their uncomplicated vision, saw clearly what adults had taken months to recognize. Daniel Crane was exactly the kind of man worth admiring. One afternoon, about 6 weeks after the flood, Abigail was working in what remained of their garden when Martha Jenkins approached. The older woman had been distant since the disaster, dealing with her own grief and loss. But now she carried something wrapped in cloth. "I wanted to give you this," Martha said, unwrapping a pie. "Apple. I found my mother's dried apples in the cellar. They survived the flood somehow. Felt like a miracle. Anyway, I thought Daniel might like it, as a thank you." "Thank you for what?" "For everything. For saving my nephew Tommy when Sam couldn't reach him. For organizing the rebuilding so my shop has a chance of opening again. For being patient with all of us when we were cruel to him." Martha's eyes filled with tears. "I was awful, Abigail. I said terrible things about your husband, called him weak and useless, told people you'd made a mistake marrying him, and he's been nothing but kind to me since, helping me sort through the wreckage of my shop, never once throwing my words back in my face." "That's just who he is," Abigail said. "He doesn't hold grudges." "More fool me for thinking kindness was weakness," Martha said. "Turns out it's the strongest thing there is. Anyway, give him the pie with my apologies and my gratitude." Similar conversations happened throughout those weeks of rebuilding. Men who'd mocked Daniel now sought his advice. Women who'd pitied Abigail now envied her. The transformation was so complete that sometimes Abigail felt like she was living in a different town entirely. Not because Larkspur had changed physically, though it had, but because its people had changed fundamentally in how they saw each other and what they valued. The new bridge was completed in early August, a sturdy structure that bore little resemblance to its predecessor. At the dedication ceremony, the governor himself showed up, a political gesture, certainly, but meaningful nonetheless. He gave a speech about frontier resilience and Colorado spirit, but then he did something unexpected. He called Daniel to the front. "Mr. Crane," the governor said, "I've heard a great deal about you, about how you organized the rescue during the flood, how you've led the rebuilding, how you've transformed this community. I'd like to offer you a position as a territorial consultant on disaster preparedness. We need people with your skills working across Colorado." The crowd erupted in applause, but Daniel looked uncomfortable. He glanced at Abigail, then at Emma, then back at the governor. "I'm honored, sir, truly, but I have to decline." The applause died into confused silence. "You're refusing?" the governor asked, clearly taken aback. With the greatest respect, yes. My place is here, in Larkspur, with my family and this community. They don't need a consultant who travels around giving advice. They need someone who stays, who's invested in the outcome, who's part of the fabric of daily life. That's what I want to be. Not a hero passing through, but just a neighbor who helps. The governor blinked, then smiled. That's a damn fine answer, Mr. Crane. This town is lucky to have you. As the ceremony continued, Sam sidled up to Daniel. You really turned down a government position? That would have been good money, prestige. I didn't come west for money or prestige, Daniel said. I came for a fresh start, and I found something better, a home. That evening, after the celebrations wound down, Daniel, Abigail, and Emma returned to their ranch. The house had survived the flood relatively intact, needing only minor repairs. The barn was solid, the fields were slowly recovering. It wasn't the same as before. Nothing would ever be exactly the same, but it was theirs, and it was enough. Emma went to bed early, exhausted from the day's excitement. Daniel and Abigail sat on the porch steps, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. The creek, returned to its normal banks now, murmured peacefully. Do you regret it? Abigail asked, turning down the governor's offer. Not even a little bit. Daniel took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. I have everything I need right here. A wife who sees me for who I am. A daughter who makes me want to be better. A community that finally accepts me. Why would I give that up to be some traveling expert? Because you could help more people? Maybe. Or maybe I'd spread myself too thin and help no one well. I think there's value in depth, not just breadth, and being fully present for a small group rather than partially present for many. Does that make sense? It does. She leaned her head on his shoulder. You know what Emma told me yesterday? She said you're the best papa in the whole world. Not step-papa, not new papa, just papa. Daniel's breath caught. She said that? She did. And she's right. Thomas gave her life, and he'll always be her father. But you're teaching her how to live that life fully, how to be curious and brave and kind. That's a different kind of gift, but just as important. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, and then Daniel said something that surprised her. I think I understand now why Catherine died. Abigail turned to look at him sharply. What? Not in a religious sense. I don't think God took her for some grand purpose, but I understand why I had to go through that grief, why I had to leave Boston, why I ended up answering your advertisement specifically. Because if none of that had happened, I wouldn't be here. Emma wouldn't have a father. You wouldn't have a partner. Larkspur wouldn't have survived the flood the way it did. It's not that Catherine's death was meant to be. It's that I'm meant to make meaning from it. Do you see the difference? I do, Abigail said. And I think Thomas would have liked you. He always said the measure of a man wasn't in how hard he could hit, but in how hard he'd work for the people he loved. Smart man. He was, and so are you. Different kinds of smart, but both valuable. Daniel pulled out his violin then, the instrument he'd barely touched since the flood, too busy with practical matters to indulge in music. He tuned it carefully, the familiar notes floating into the evening air, and then he played. Not something mournful this time, but something hopeful. A folk melody that spoke of hard work and good harvests, of children laughing and communities thriving. The kind of music that celebrated the small, vital joys of everyday life, rather than grand tragedies or dramatic triumphs. Abigail closed her eyes and listened, and in that moment she understood something fundamental. Daniel would never be the rough cowboy she'd thought she needed when she placed that advertisement. He would never be loud or aggressive or traditionally strong, but he was something better. He was steadfast. He was thoughtful. He was brave in the quiet way that mattered most. The kind of brave that showed up day after day, doing what needed doing, caring when it would be easier not to. The mail-order husband everyone had laughed at had become the man nobody could do without, not through force or swagger, but through patience and principle, and the stubborn belief that kindness wasn't weakness. It was the foundation everything else was built on. And in a town that had learned that lesson the hardest possible way, Daniel Crane was no longer a laughingstock. He was simply what he'd always been underneath the mockery and doubt. exactly the right man at exactly the right time, proving that sometimes the person everyone underestimates is precisely the person everyone needs most. The violin's last notes faded into the night, replaced by the comfortable sounds of the prairie settling into darkness. Abigail opened her eyes and found Daniel watching her with an expression she'd come to recognize. Not quite contentment, but something close to it. Peace, maybe. Or the beginning of it. "Play that again sometime," she said. "When Emma's awake. She should hear it." "I will." He set the violin carefully in its case, treating it with the same reverence he'd shown that first day stepping off the train. "Though I've been thinking, the children in town need music lessons. Real lessons, not just me playing on the porch. What if we started a music program at the school?" "Daniel, we barely have a school. Half the building collapsed in the flood. Which is why we're rebuilding it. And when we do, we should build it better. Not just stronger walls, but a better education. Music, art, advanced mathematics for the students who want it. A real library, not just whatever books families happen to own." There it was again, that vision of something more than mere survival. Daniel didn't just want Larkspur to recover. He wanted it to thrive, to become the kind of place where children like Emma could dream bigger than the prairie horizon. It was ambitious to the point of seeming impractical, except that he'd already proven the impractical could become real if you worked steadily enough toward it. "You're going to exhaust yourself trying to change the whole world," Abigail said, but there was affection in her voice. "Not the whole world, just our small corner of it." He stood, offering his hand. "Come on, tomorrow's another long day. We should sleep while we can." But sleep didn't come easily that night, despite Daniel's exhaustion. Abigail lay awake in the darkness of their bedroom. They'd finally, tentatively, decided to share the space, listening to his breathing and thinking about how much had changed in just a few months. The nervous stranger who'd stepped off the train had become someone she trusted more than she'd trusted anyone except Thomas. The husband she'd ordered from an advertisement had become a partner she couldn't imagine living without. "Are you awake?" Daniel whispered into the darkness. "Yes." "I'm terrified I'm going to fail them." She rolled over to face him, though she could barely see his outline in the moonlight filtering through the curtains. "Who?" "Everyone. The town. They're counting on me now, looking to me for answers. What if I make a mistake? What if someone gets hurt because I didn't think of something I should have thought of? Then we deal with it together. That's what partnership means, Daniel. You don't have to carry everything alone. But they don't look to you the way they look to me. They don't ask you to make decisions about bridge construction or water distribution or how to organize work crews. That's all on me. And what if—" "Stop." She reached out in the darkness until she found his hand. "You're not alone in this. Yes, people come to you with questions because you've proven you can answer them. But you always bring those questions to others. You ask Sam about practical construction. You consult with Frank about resources. You listen to Mrs. Chen about water management. You're not some dictator making decisions from on high. You're facilitating, Daniel. There's a difference." He was quiet for a long moment. "I never wanted to be a leader. I just wanted to teach children and play music and maybe have a family. Somehow I've ended up responsible for an entire town's future." "You're not responsible for it. You're just helping them be responsible for themselves. And you're doing it well. Look at how much has changed since the flood. Not just the buildings, the people. They're working together now in ways they never did before. That's because of you. It's because of the disaster. Tragedy brings people together. Tragedy can bring people together or tear them apart. The difference is leadership, your leadership." She squeezed his hand. "So yes, be terrified. Use that fear to stay careful, to keep thinking through decisions, to remain humble. But don't let it paralyze you. These people need you, and you need to trust that you're capable of what they're asking. Even when I don't feel capable? Especially then. Confidence without competence is dangerous, but you have both, even if you can't always see it." He pulled her closer, and they lay tangled together in the darkness, two people bound by circumstances that had somehow become choice. Somewhere outside, an owl called. The creek murmured its endless song, and slowly, finally, Daniel's breathing deepened into sleep. August turned to September, and with it came the hard work of preparing for winter. The destroyed homes needed to be rebuilt or replaced before the first snow. Gardens needed to be replanted with fall crops that might still yield something before frost. Firewood needed to be cut and stacked. Food needed to be preserved. The list of tasks seemed endless, but the town had developed a rhythm now, a system of cooperation that made the impossible merely difficult. Daniel's role evolved as the immediate crisis faded into long-term recovery. He was no longer just organizing rescue efforts or designing bridges. Now he found himself mediating disputes, teaching classes, planning for futures that extended beyond the next meal or the next day. The school reopened in a temporary building, actually just a large tent donated by the territorial government, and Daniel resumed teaching, though his student body had grown considerably. Word had spread about the quality of his instruction, and families from surrounding homesteads began sending their children to Larkspur specifically to study with him. "You've become quite famous," Reverend Thomas told him one Sunday after services. "People 3 counties over are talking about the school teacher who saved a town." Daniel looked uncomfortable with the praise, as he always did. "I didn't save anyone. The town saved itself." That's not how the story's being told. And stories matter, Daniel. They shape how people understand the world. Right now, the story of Larkspur is about a community that came together under good leadership. That's a powerful narrative, especially out here where everyone's struggling to survive. I just hope the reality lives up to the story. But the reality was proving more complex than any simple narrative could capture. Not everyone in Larkspur had embraced the changes the flood had forced upon them. A few families, particularly those who'd lost the most, were talking about leaving. The Morrison parents, grieving their twins, couldn't bear to stay in a place that reminded them of loss. 2 other families whose homes had been completely destroyed saw no path to recovery and were planning to move to Denver or further west. Daniel met with each family privately, never trying to convince them to stay against their will, but making sure they knew their options and had the resources to make informed choices. He helped the Morrisons sell their land at a fair price, even connecting them with buyers in Denver. He wrote letters of recommendation for those seeking work elsewhere. And when they left, he stood with others at the station watching the train carry away pieces of the community they'd fought to preserve. "It feels like failure," he told Abigail that night. "We survived the flood, rebuilt the town, and still we're losing people." "Not everyone can stay," she said gently. "The grief is too much for some. That's not your failure, Daniel. That's just human nature." "But what if more leave? What if we rebuild everything only to have it become a ghost town?" "Then we adjust. But look around. For every family leaving, there's another one staying because of what you've built here. The school alone is bringing people in. Mrs. Chen told me yesterday that 2 new families have inquired about settling in Larkspur specifically because they heard about the quality of education. That wouldn't have happened before." She was right, though Daniel struggled to see it clearly. The town was changing, yes, but change meant uncertainty. Some days it felt like they were building a better future. Other days it felt like they were just delaying an inevitable collapse. The crisis came in late September, from a direction no one had anticipated. It started with Pete Parker riding into town at full gallop, his horse lathered and his face pale with fear. He found Daniel at the school, teaching a mathematics lesson to a dozen students ranging from Emma's age to teenagers nearly grown. "Daniel!" Pete burst through the tent flap. "We need you at the Parker Ranch, now!" Daniel looked up from the chalkboard where he'd been demonstrating long division. "What's wrong?" "Sam, he's been shot." The tent erupted in gasps and questions, but Daniel was already moving. He grabbed his medical bag, he'd restocked it from donations after the flood, and turned to his oldest student, a 17-year-old named James. "You're in charge. Continue with the lesson. I'll be back as soon as I can." He followed Pete outside where 2 horses waited. "How bad is it?" "Bad. He was checking the fence line near the creek when someone shot him. We don't know who, we don't know why. My pa found him about an hour ago, got him back to the house, but he's bleeding bad and we don't have a doctor." "I'm not a doctor, Pete. You're the closest thing we've got. Please!" They rode hard, covering the 5 miles to the Parker Ranch in less than 20 minutes. Daniel's mind raced through everything he'd learned about treating wounds during his brief time as a school nurse. Bullet wounds were beyond his experience, but the principles were the same as any trauma: stop the bleeding, prevent infection, stabilize the patient. The Parker house was a sturdy log structure that had survived the flood intact. Inside, Sam lay on the kitchen table, his shirt soaked with blood. His wife Mary hovered nearby, her face streaked with tears. Sam's father, old Jim Parker, stood by the window with a rifle, watching the prairie as if expecting whoever shot Sam to return. "Thank God," Mary said when Daniel entered. "I didn't know what to do. There's so much blood." Daniel forced his hands to stop shaking and moved to the table. Sam was conscious but pale, his breathing shallow. The wound was in his left shoulder, high up near the collarbone. Daniel could see the entry wound but no exit wound, which meant the bullet was still inside. "Sam, can you hear me?" "Unfortunately, yes." Sam's voice was weak, but his eyes were clear. "Hurts like hell, Crane." "I'm sure it does. I need to examine the wound. This is going to hurt worse." "Do what you need to do." Daniel had Sam's shirt cut away and carefully cleaned around the wound with whiskey, the best antiseptic available. The bullet had entered from the front and traveled backward and slightly down, lodging somewhere in the muscle tissue. If it had been 2 inches to the right, it would have hit the lung and Sam would already be dead. As it was, he was losing blood steadily, and the bullet needed to come out before infection set in. "Mary, I need you to boil water, as much as you can, and bring me clean cloth towels, anything white or recently washed." He turned to Pete. "How long ago was he shot?" "Maybe 2 hours. Pa found him about an hour ago. Took another hour to get him home, and then for me to ride to town and back." 2 hours. Not ideal, but not catastrophic. Daniel opened his medical bag and pulled out the basic surgical tools he'd acquired: a probe, forceps, a scalpel. They were meant for removing splinters and treating minor cuts, not extracting bullets, but they'd have to do. "Sam, I've never done this before. I'm going to do my best, but you need to know—" "I know, Crane. I trust you anyway. Just make it quick." Daniel gave Sam a leather strap to bite down on and a bottle of whiskey to drink. Not anesthetic exactly, but it would help with the pain. Then he began the slow, careful work of probing the wound, trying to locate the bullet without causing more damage. Sam bore it with remarkable stoicism for the first few minutes, his jaw clenched around the leather strap, sweat pouring down his face. But when Daniel finally located the bullet and began trying to extract it with the forceps, Sam screamed, a raw, animal sound of pure agony. Mary had to leave the room. Jim Parker's hands tightened on his rifle until his knuckles went white. "Almost there," Daniel said, his own hand steady despite his racing heart. "Just a little more." The forceps closed around something solid. Daniel pulled, slowly, carefully, feeling resistance. The bullet was lodged in muscle tissue and didn't want to come free. He adjusted his angle, pulled again, and suddenly it was out. A misshapen piece of lead that had been designed to end Sam Parker's life. "Got it," Daniel said, and Sam passed out immediately, his body finally giving up the fight to stay conscious. Daniel worked quickly now, cleaning the wound thoroughly, packing it with clean cloth, stitching it closed with sutures from his medical bag. The stitching wasn't pretty. His hands were shaking now that the immediate crisis was over, but it was functional. Finally, he bandaged the shoulder tightly to prevent more bleeding. "He'll need to rest for at least 2 weeks, Daniel told Mary and Jim when he was finished. "Maybe longer. The wound needs to heal from the inside out. Watch for signs of infection, fever, red streaks spreading from the wound, unusual swelling. Change the bandages daily using boiled water. And for God's sake, don't let him get on a horse or do any heavy labor. His shoulder needs time." "Will he live?" Mary asked. "If infection doesn't set in, yes. He's strong, and the bullet missed anything vital, but the next few days are critical." Jim Parker finally spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "Thank you, son. You saved his life." "I just removed a bullet. His body has to do the actual saving." "Still, thank you." Jim paused, then added, "There's something else we need to discuss. Whoever shot Sam is still out there. This wasn't an accident. The shot came from too far away, and there's no reason for anyone to be shooting near our property. Someone targeted my boy." The implications settled over the room like a heavy blanket. If Sam had been deliberately attacked, then they had a larger problem. Crime was rare in Larkspur. The community was too small, everyone too visible, for serious wrongdoing to go unnoticed. A shooting meant either an outsider or something dark festering beneath the town's surface. "We need to tell Frank," Daniel said. Frank Hollister, in addition to running the hardware store, served as Larkspur's informal lawman. And we need to figure out who did this and why. I have some ideas about the who, Jim said darkly. There's a homesteader who's been squatting on the land the flood carved through. Used to be Pete's claim, but the creek changed course, and now the territory says it's unowned. This homesteader, fellow named Brennan, he's been trying to establish rights to it. Sam told him yesterday that we were disputing the claim. They argued about it. An argument's a long way from attempted murder. You haven't met Brennan. He's a hard man. Came from Missouri after some trouble there. Won't say what kind of trouble, which tells you everything you need to know. Daniel considered this. Still, we can't accuse someone without evidence. Let me talk to Frank. We'll figure this out properly. He rode back to town as the sun was setting, exhausted and shaken. His hands still smelled like blood despite washing them thoroughly at the Parker Ranch. He'd saved Sam's life, probably, but the reality of what that meant was only now sinking in. He'd performed surgery, actual surgery, with tools meant for splinters. If he'd made a mistake, if his hands had slipped, if he'd cut the wrong thing, Sam would have bled out on that kitchen table. Abigail met him on the porch when he arrived home, took one look at his face, and pulled him into her arms without a word. He stood there, letting her hold him, letting himself shake now that no one was watching, letting the fear and adrenaline drain away. "Is he alive?" she finally asked. "For now, the bullet's out. If infection doesn't kill him, he should recover. You did good, Daniel." "I got lucky. I've never removed a bullet before. I was guessing half the time, just hoping I didn't kill him myself." "But you didn't. You saved him. And now you need to eat something and rest." But rest would have to wait. Within an hour, Frank Hollister arrived with Reverend Thomas and 3 other men, all wanting to know what happened and what should be done about it. Daniel recounted the story, including Jim Parker's suspicions about Brennan. "I know Brennan," Frank said, his face grim. "Showed up about a month after the flood, claimed he was looking for a fresh start. But there's something off about him. Keeps to himself, won't look you in the eye. Always seems angry about something." "That doesn't make him a shooter," Daniel pointed out. "Lots of people are antisocial. It doesn't mean they're criminals." "So what do we do?" Reverend Thomas asked. "We don't have real law enforcement here. The nearest marshal is 2 days' ride away. If someone in this town has turned violent, we need to handle it ourselves." The room fell silent as everyone considered the implications. Frontier justice was a delicate thing, necessary sometimes, but too easily corrupted into mob violence. Daniel had read about towns that tore themselves apart with vigilante justice, where accusations became executions and fear replaced order. "We investigate," Daniel said finally, "so properly. We talk to Brennan, ask where he was when Sam was shot, see if his story holds up. We look for evidence, spent shells, footprints, anything that might point to who did this. We don't assume, and we definitely don't act until we're certain." "And if Brennan did it?" Frank asked. "What then?" "Then we hold him until the marshal can collect him. We have a legal system, even out here. We use it. The marshal won't come for weeks. We're supposed to just sit on our hands while a shooter walks free?" "We're supposed to be better than summary execution," Daniel said sharply. "That's what separates civilization from chaos. Yes, it's slower. Yes, it's frustrating, but it's right." The debate continued for another hour, with some men arguing for immediate action and others supporting Daniel's more cautious approach. Eventually, a compromise emerged. They'd investigate, but they'd also post watches around town and the surrounding homesteads. If Brennan was the shooter, he wouldn't get another opportunity. And if someone else was responsible, the heightened vigilance might prevent another attack. Over the next 3 days, Daniel found himself acting as both investigator and diplomat. He rode out to Brennan's claim with Frank and Reverend Thomas, a show of official authority without being overtly threatening. Brennan was exactly as Jim Parker had described, hard-eyed, suspicious, unwelcoming. But his story checked out. He'd been in town the day Sam was shot, multiple witnesses could confirm it, and he had no rifle that matched the caliber of bullet Daniel had removed from Sam's shoulder. "Doesn't mean he's innocent," Frank muttered as they rode away. "Could have hired someone." "Could have, but we have no evidence of that." Daniel was frustrated too, but he refused to let frustration override reason. "We keep looking." They interviewed everyone who'd been near the Parker property that day. They searched for spent shells or tracks or any physical evidence. They asked about strangers passing through town, about grudges or disputes that might have motivated violence. Slowly, painstakingly, they eliminated possibilities. And then Emma, of all people, provided the breakthrough. She was helping organize books in the temporary school when she overheard two older boys talking. "So I heard my pa say that Mr. Henderson's nephew was asking about the Parker land," one boy said. "Something about inheritance rights now that Mr. Henderson's dead." Daniel, overhearing this, felt pieces click into place. Mr. Henderson, the old shopkeeper who died in the flood, had a nephew in Denver, a nephew who'd come to claim his uncle's property and had been angry to discover it was worth almost nothing after the disaster. A nephew who'd been in town the week Sam was shot, staying at Mrs. Chen's boarding house. Within hours, Frank and Daniel had tracked the nephew down. He'd already left Larkspur, but Mrs. Chen confirmed he'd borrowed her late husband's rifle, the right caliber, and had been gone all day on the date of the shooting. When they finally caught up with him 2 days later in a town 30 miles west, he confessed almost immediately. He'd wanted the Parker land because he'd heard it might have silver deposits. He'd shot Sam hoping to scare the Parkers into abandoning their claim. "What happens to him now?" Abigail asked when Daniel returned home, exhausted from 2 days of hard riding. "We turned him over to the territorial marshal. He'll be tried in Denver." Daniel slumped into a chair. "And the Parker land doesn't have any silver. That was just a rumor someone started. He shot a man over nothing." "But Sam's going to live, and the shooter's caught. That's not nothing." "No," Daniel agreed. "But it's been a reminder of how fragile this all is. We built a community, but we're still just a collection of individuals with our own wants and fears. One person's greed, and the whole thing nearly fell apart again." Sam Parker recovered slowly, his shoulder healing over the course of weeks. When he was finally well enough to ride into town again, he went straight to the school to find Daniel. "I owe you my life," Sam said, his left arm still in a sling. "That's a debt I can never fully repay." "You don't owe me anything," Daniel said. "I just did what needed doing." "See, that's the thing about you, Crane. You always just do what needs doing, no matter how hard it is. Saving people from floods, removing bullets, solving crimes. You never stop to ask if something's beyond you. You just try. And sometimes I fail. But mostly you don't. And when you do fail, you learn from it and do better next time." Sam shifted his weight, clearly still in pain but determined to say his piece. "I was the worst to you when you first got here. Called you useless, made fun of your violin and your books and your soft hands. I wanted you to fail because it made me feel better about myself. And you never once held it against me. You just kept being decent, kept showing up, kept doing the work. That's taught me more than any shooting lesson ever could." "People deserve second chances," Daniel said. "Third chances, even. We're all just trying to figure out how to be better than we were." "Well, I'm trying to be more like you, patient, thoughtful, willing to admit when I'm wrong." Sam grinned. "Don't know if I'll ever be good at it, but I'm trying." As autumn deepened into winter's first approach, Larkspur continued its transformation. The new bridge stood solid, tested by fall rains and proving Daniel's design sound. The school was finally moved into a proper building, constructed with funds from donations and territorial grants. Houses were rebuilt, businesses reopened, and the town began to resemble something more than just a disaster recovery site. But more than the physical reconstruction, something had shifted in the community's spirit. The mockery and casual cruelty that had defined Daniel's early months had been replaced with genuine respect. People sought his counsel not because they had to, but because they valued his perspective. They followed his lead not out of desperation, but out of trust. One evening in late October, as the first real cold settled over the prairie, Larkspur held a community dinner in the new church hall. Everyone contributed what they could: roasted chickens, vegetables from the fall harvest, pies and bread and preserves. It was a celebration of survival, of rebuilding, of making it through the hardest season any of them had ever known. Daniel stood to speak, not because he'd been asked to give a formal speech, but because people expected him to say something. He looked out at the faces gathered around the tables: Sam and his family, Frank and Martha, Mrs. Chen and Reverend Thomas, Pete and all the others. People who'd laughed at him, people who'd doubted him, people who'd become somehow his people. "I'm not good at speeches," he began, which made several people chuckle. "But I want to say something about this community. When I first arrived, I wasn't what anyone expected or wanted. I was different, and difference made me suspect. But you all taught me something important. Communities aren't built on everyone being the same. They're built on everyone being willing to work together despite their differences. You needed someone organized, and I could be that. I needed people who understood this land and how to work it, and you were that. Together, we made something neither of us could have made alone." He paused, gathering his thoughts. The flood destroyed a lot. Buildings, lives, certainty about the future. But it also revealed something that was always there beneath the surface: the capacity of ordinary people to be extraordinary when circumstances demand it. Every person in this room has been a hero in the last 6 months. You've rebuilt, persevered, supported each other. That's not because I organized it. That's because you chose to. I just gave you a framework to work within. "Stop being so humble," Frank called out. "You saved this town, Crane. Own it." "No," Daniel said firmly. "We saved this town, all of us together. And that's the truth I want us to remember going forward. Not the story of one person being heroic, but the story of a whole community deciding to be heroic together. That's what I hope we pass down to our children. Not that they need to be like any one of us, but that they need to work with each other, value each other's different strengths, and build something bigger than any individual could create alone." The dinner continued late into the night with music and laughter and the warm feeling of belonging that comes from shared struggle and shared triumph. Daniel played his violin, folk songs and dance tunes that got people moving and clapping. Children ran between the tables, playing games and stealing extra cookies. Adults talked and planned and dreamed about futures that suddenly seemed possible again. And in the midst of it all, Daniel Crane, the mail-order husband who'd arrived with a violin and a suitcase of books, the laughingstock who'd become the leader, the gentle fool who'd proven to be the wisest one among them, understood that he'd finally found what he'd been searching for when he left Boston. Not escape from grief, not proof that he was strong enough, not revenge against those who doubted him, just a place where he belonged, a family that chose him as much as he'd chosen them, and a community that had learned the hardest possible way that trust isn't about power or swagger or meeting expectations. Trust is earned through action, proven through crisis, and built one difficult choice at a time by people who decide that who you are matters more than who they wanted you to be. Winter came to Colorado with its customary brutality, transforming the prairie into an endless expanse of white silence. The first heavy snow fell in early November, blanketing Larkspur in 2 feet of powder that made travel nearly impossible and turned the rebuilt town into an isolated island. But this time, unlike winters past, the community was prepared. Food stores were full from the fall harvest. Firewood had been cut and stacked throughout the summer. Every home had been weatherproofed and reinforced. The preparations Daniel had insisted on, the ones some had grumbled about as excessive, proved their worth when the temperature dropped below zero and stayed there for weeks. The school continued despite the weather, with children trudging through snowdrifts to reach the building where Daniel had installed a massive stove that kept the space warm enough for learning. Emma thrived in her role as his assistant, helping younger students with their letters while Daniel worked with the older ones on advanced subjects. She was reading at a level years beyond her age now, devouring books on history, science, and literature with an appetite that both thrilled and worried her mother. "What if she grows beyond this place?" Abigail asked Daniel one night as they sat by their own fire, mending clothes while the wind howled outside. "What if she wants more than Larkspur can give her?" "Then we help her find it," Daniel said without hesitation. "That's what parents do, prepare their children for the lives they want, not the lives we want for them." "But she's only 8. I'm not ready to think about her leaving." "She's 8 now. She'll be 18 before we blink. And when that day comes, I want her to have every possible choice available to her. That means education, opportunity, and the confidence to pursue whatever calls to her." He set down the shirt he was mending and looked at Abigail seriously. "I know that's frightening. Thomas grew up here, died here, and probably expected Emma to do the same. But the world is changing, Abigail. The frontier is closing. In 20 years, Colorado will look nothing like it does now. Our children need to be ready for that world, not just this one. You sound like you've been thinking about this a lot. I have. Because it's not just Emma. It's all the children in this town. They deserve better than what most frontier communities offer, which is basic literacy and arithmetic, then a life of hard labor with no other options. I want them to know they can be more if they choose. Ranchers or teachers, farmers or doctors, whatever they want. But they can't choose if they don't know the options exist. Abigail studied her husband in the firelight. He'd changed over the months since that terrible night of the flood. The softness that had made him seem weak was still there. The gentleness in how he spoke to children, the patience with which he explained difficult concepts, the kindness he showed to everyone regardless of how they'd treated him. But it was tempered now with something harder, a core of certainty about who he was and what he valued. He'd stopped apologizing for being different. He'd stopped trying to become what others expected. He was simply, completely himself. "I love you," she said suddenly. "I don't think I've ever actually said that out loud." Daniel looked startled, then pleased, then almost shy. "I love you too, though I wasn't sure you felt the same. Our marriage started so practically, an arrangement, a solution to problems. I was afraid that's all it would ever be." "It was that at first," Abigail admitted. "I needed help with the ranch and someone to be a father to Emma. You needed a fresh start and a purpose. But somewhere along the way it became something else. I'm not sure exactly when." "I am," Daniel said. "The flood. When you grabbed my hand in the church and told me I wasn't alone. That's when I knew this was real. That we were real." The moment stretched between them, warm and comfortable. Outside, the wind continued its assault on the house, but inside they were safe, together, building something that would outlast any storm. The winter brought unexpected visitors in late December. A delegation from Denver arrived on a clear, bitterly cold day when the roads were finally passable again. The territorial governor, a newspaper reporter, and a representative from the Department of the Interior. They came in a fancy carriage that looked absurdly out of place against the rough frontier buildings, and they came specifically to see Daniel. "Mr. Crane," the governor said, shaking Daniel's hand in front of the school where a crowd had gathered, "I've been hearing remarkable things about what you've accomplished here in Larkspur. The disaster recovery, the community organization, the educational programs you've established. Quite impressive for a school teacher from Boston." Daniel bristled slightly at the condescension in the man's tone, but kept his voice level. "The community accomplished it, Governor. I just helped organize the effort." "Yes, well, that's exactly the kind of modesty we need more of in public service." The governor gestured to his companions. "I'd like to discuss an opportunity with you. Privately, perhaps?" They adjourned to the church, where Reverend Thomas provided coffee and privacy. The governor got straight to the point. "The territory is expanding rapidly. We're expecting statehood within a few years. When that happens, we'll need educated, capable people in positions of authority, people who understand both practical governance and community building. I'd like to offer you a position as regional superintendent of schools. You'd oversee education for this entire district, help establish standards, train other teachers. The pay is good, the position is prestigious, and you'd have real influence over the future of Colorado's children." Daniel listened carefully, then asked the question the governor probably wasn't expecting. "Would I have to leave Larkspur?" "The position is based in Denver. You'd travel throughout the region, of course, but your primary residence would need to be in the capital." "Then I'm afraid I have to decline." The governor's carefully maintained political smile slipped. "Mr. Crane, perhaps you don't understand the significance of what I'm offering. This is a chance to shape education for thousands of children, not just the few dozen in this small town. Your ideas about advanced curriculum, about making education accessible to all students regardless of background, those could become policy across the territory." "I understand completely, Governor, and I appreciate the offer. But my place is here, with this community, with my family. I can do more good working deeply with people I know and care about than spreading myself thin trying to influence people I'll never meet." The newspaper reporter, who'd been scribbling notes throughout, looked up with interest. "That's a remarkable statement, Mr. Crane. Most men would jump at the chance for power and prestige." "Then most men and I have different priorities," Daniel said. "Power without connection is empty. Prestige without purpose is hollow. I didn't come west to climb social ladders. I came to build a life, and that's what I'm doing. The governor tried several more angles of persuasion, but Daniel remained firm. Finally, frustrated but grudgingly respectful, the delegation left. The reporter stayed behind for a few minutes, asking questions for the article he was writing. "Can I ask you something off the record?" the reporter said as he was packing up his notes. "Why do you really stay? A man with your education, your capabilities, you could do anything, be anyone. Why tie yourself to a tiny frontier town that most people have never heard of?" Daniel considered the question seriously, because size doesn't equal significance. Every person in Larkspur knows my name, and I know theirs. I know their children, their struggles, their dreams. When I make a decision about curriculum, I see its impact immediately in the faces of students I teach every day. When I help organize community projects, I see the results in neighbors I care about. That direct connection, that immediate accountability, you can't get that working from an office in Denver, no matter how much influence you have on paper. "That's going to make a hell of a quote," the reporter said, grinning. "The man who turned down power for purpose. People will eat that up." "I'd rather you not print that, actually. This town has had enough attention. We're just trying to live our lives." But the story ran anyway, appearing in papers across Colorado and even being picked up by Eastern publications. For a few weeks, Larkspur found itself famous again, not as the disaster town that survived, but as the place where the school teacher chose community over career. Letters arrived from readers, some praising Daniel's decision, others calling him a fool for wasting his talents. Emma read the articles with wide eyes, struggling with some of the bigger words but getting the general sense. "Papa Daniel, it says here you could have been important. Did you really say no?" "I said no to being important in Denver," Daniel corrected gently. "I didn't say no to being important to you, to your mother, to the students I teach, and the neighbors I help. That's the kind of importance that matters to me." "But you could have changed things for everyone." "Could have, maybe. Or I might have become just another bureaucrat pushing papers and losing touch with why education matters in the first place." "That happens a lot in government, Emma. People start with good intentions and end up so far removed from the actual work that they forget what they were trying to accomplish." He pulled her onto his lap, something she was getting almost too big for. "Besides, I'm changing things for everyone. Just not all at once, and not from a position of power. Real change happens slowly, person by person, conversation by conversation. That's the kind of change that lasts." The attention from the newspaper articles brought an unexpected consequence in early spring. A young woman arrived in Larkspur looking for Daniel, carrying a carpet bag and an air of desperate determination. She found him at the school during afternoon lessons and waited patiently until he dismissed his students. "Mr. Crane? My name is Margaret Sullivan. I'm a teacher from Philadelphia. I read about your school, about what you're trying to build here, and She paused, gathering courage. "I want to help. I want to teach here, if you'll have me." Daniel was taken aback. "Miss Sullivan, I appreciate the offer, but I'm not sure we can support 2 teachers. The town is small, resources are limited. I don't need much, just room and board, and the chance to make a difference. I've been teaching in Philadelphia for 3 years, and it's soul-crushing. 60 children in a classroom, no supplies, administrators who care more about discipline than learning. When I read about your school, about students learning Latin and advanced mathematics, about education being accessible to everyone regardless of background, that's what I became a teacher for. Please, Mr. Crane, let me prove myself." Daniel looked at this young woman who reminded him so much of himself 8 months ago. Eager, idealistic, willing to leave everything familiar for a chance at something meaningful. He thought about the growing enrollment, about the families still sending their children from surrounding homesteads, about how he was stretching himself thin, trying to teach 3 different grade levels simultaneously. "All right," he said, 2-month trial. I'll talk to the town council about finding you accommodation and arranging a small salary. If it works out, we'll make it permanent. Fair?" Margaret's face lit up with joy so pure it made Daniel smile. "More than fair. Thank you, Mr. Crane. You won't regret this." But the town council, when he presented the idea that evening, was less enthusiastic. Frank Hollister, who'd become one of Daniel's strongest supporters, nonetheless had concerns. 2 teachers for a town this size? Daniel, we're still recovering from the flood. We've got limited funds, and hiring another teacher means less money for other needs. What other needs are more important than education? Daniel challenged. We've rebuilt the buildings. We've secured food supplies. We've established trade routes. The next step is investing in the future, and that means investing in children. Miss Sullivan is offering to work for minimal compensation. She's qualified, experienced, and passionate. And with her help, we could expand our programs even further. Music classes, art, sciences we don't currently teach. We could become the best school in the territory. Or we could waste money we don't have on fancy ideas, another council member said. Basic reading and arithmetic is good enough for frontier children. Is it? Daniel's voice was sharp now, his patience worn thin by months of fighting for every improvement. Is good enough really what we want for our children? Because I've seen what happens to communities that settle for good enough. They stagnate, die, become ghost towns when something better comes along. If we want Larkspur to thrive, to be a place where people want to stay and raise families, we need to offer more than just basic survival. We need to offer opportunity. The debate continued for hours, with council members arguing back and forth about budgets and priorities and visions for the town's future. Daniel made his case passionately but carefully, using specific examples of how expanded education would benefit the community. He pointed out families who'd already moved to Larkspur specifically for the school. He talked about property values increasing when towns had strong educational institutions. He painted a picture of a future where Larkspur wasn't just another small frontier town, but a center of learning and culture. In the end, the vote was close, but it passed. Margaret Sullivan would be hired on a trial basis, with the understanding that her position depended on enrollment remaining strong and the town's finances staying stable. Margaret threw herself into teaching with the same intensity Daniel had brought to everything he'd done in Larkspur. She took over the younger students, implementing innovative teaching methods she'd learned in Philadelphia. She started a girls' reading circle, recognizing that female students often got overlooked in frontier education. She organized a spring concert where students performed music and recitations, giving the community something to celebrate after a long, hard winter. Emma, now 9 and reading at an 8th grade level, blossomed under Margaret's attention. The two formed a bond that Abigail watched with mixed emotions. Pride that her daughter had such an excellent mentor, but also a twinge of jealousy and worry about Emma growing beyond the simple ranch life. She talks about Philadelphia now, Abigail told Daniel one evening. About universities and libraries and museums, things we can't give her here. Not yet, Daniel said. But someday, if that's what she wants, we'll find a way. I've been setting aside money for my teaching salary. By the time she's 17 or 18, we should have enough saved to send her east for education if she chooses that path. And if she chooses it, if she leaves and never comes back, then we'll be sad, but we'll be proud, because we raised a daughter who knew she had choices and wasn't afraid to make them. Daniel took Abigail's hand. Our job isn't to keep her here forever. Our job is to give her roots strong enough that she can grow wings. Spring brought new life to the prairie and new challenges to Larkspur. The winter had been hard on the cattle, and several families had lost significant portions of their herds. The Parker Ranch, still recovering from Sam's injury in the shooting, was hit particularly hard. When Sam came to Daniel in April, his face was grim with worry. I'm going to have to sell the land, Sam said. Can't afford to restock the herd, can't make the ranch profitable with what's left. I've got offers from buyers in Denver, investors who want to buy up frontier land cheap and hold it until Colorado gets statehood. But if I sell to them, it won't be a ranch anymore. It'll just be speculation property, sitting empty while they wait for values to increase. How much do you need to keep it? Daniel asked. More than I have. Maybe $300 to buy enough cattle to rebuild the herd properly. I've got about half that saved, but the rest... Sam shrugged helplessly. I can't borrow it. No bank will loan to a frontier rancher with no collateral. Daniel was quiet for a moment, thinking. What if the community pooled resources? A group investment, several families contributing what they can, with the understanding that they get paid back with interest once the ranch is profitable again. That's asking a lot. Why would anyone risk their money on my ranch? Because your ranch failing affects everyone. If outside investors start buying up land around here, they'll drive up prices and push out the people who actually want to live and work here. We need to keep Larkspur in the hands of people who care about Larkspur. That's worth investing in. Daniel presented the idea at the next town meeting, framing it as community preservation rather than charity. He'd done the mathematics, calculated reasonable interest rates, projected timelines for repayment, but more importantly, he'd talked to people individually beforehand, gauging interest, building support, ensuring the proposal wouldn't be a surprise. The response surprised even him. Not just a few families, but over 20 households pledged money, some as little as $5, others contributing $50 or more. Mrs. Chen offered $100, saying her boarding house was thriving because of the families moving to Larkspur for the school, so she wanted to invest in keeping those families here. Frank Hollister contributed $75. Even some of the families who'd been hardest hit by the flood managed to spare something small. Within a week, they'd raised nearly $500, more than enough to save the Parker Ranch and establish a community fund for future emergencies. Sam Parker stood in the church where the money had been collected and counted, looking at the pile of cash and promissory notes that represented his neighbors' faith in him, and broke down crying. Not quiet tears, but great heaving sobs that shook his shoulders. "I don't deserve this," he managed to say. "I was cruel to so many of you. I mocked Daniel when he first got here. I haven't always been a good neighbor. Why would you do this for me?" "Because that's what communities do," Daniel said quietly. "They support each other, especially during hard times. You've changed, Sam. You've grown. And even if you hadn't, even if you were still the man who mocked me at the train station, you'd still be part of this community. We don't abandon our own." The investment paid off. Sam restocked his herd and implemented new ranching techniques Margaret had researched from agricultural journals. By fall, the Parker Ranch was not just surviving, but thriving. Sam began making payments to his investors ahead of schedule, his pride demanding he prove their faith in him was justified. But more importantly, the cooperative investment established a precedent. When other families faced hardships, the community had a model for helping without reducing anyone to charity. It was support with dignity, assistance with accountability. Daniel's influence again, though he never took credit for it. He just facilitated, organized, helped people see possibilities they hadn't imagined. The summer brought another challenge that would test everything Daniel had built. A fever outbreak hit Larkspur in July, spreading through the children first and then to adults. It started with the Baker twins, who came to school flushed and complaining of headaches. By the next day, 5 more children were sick. Within a week, half the town was affected. Daniel closed the school immediately and converted it into a makeshift infirmary. He'd been reading medical journals all winter, one of his many ongoing self-education projects, and recognized the symptoms as possibly scarlet fever. It was the disease that had killed his fiancée, Catherine, and the irony wasn't lost on him. The illness that had driven him west was now threatening his new home. He organized the response with the same methodical precision he'd brought to the flood recovery. Quarantine protocols to prevent spread, nursing rotations so caregivers didn't exhaust themselves, hydration and fever management strategies based on the latest medical understanding. He sent riders to Denver for a doctor, though he knew it would take days for help to arrive. Emma caught the fever despite Abigail's best efforts to keep her isolated. Daniel found his daughter burning with fever, her throat so swollen she could barely swallow, and felt terror crash over him like the floodwaters had months before. "Not her, please, not her." "I'm scared, Papa Daniel," Emma whispered, her voice raw and painful. "I know, sweetheart. I'm scared too. But we're going to fight this together, all right? You're strong. Your body knows how to heal. We just need to help it along." He bathed her forehead with cool water, gave her small sips of liquid, even though swallowing hurt, sat with her through the night when the fever made her delirious, and calling for her first father. Abigail worked herself to exhaustion caring for Emma and helping with other sick children. Margaret took charge of organizing meals for families too ill to cook. Sam and Frank coordinated a system for delivering supplies to quarantined households. The whole town mobilized, using the organizational structures Daniel had established during the flood, responding to crisis with practiced efficiency. 3 children died. The Morrison family lost another child, their youngest daughter, only 6 years old. Old Jim Parker succumbed to complications from the fever. Mrs. Patterson's sister, who'd moved to Larkspur after the flood to be closer to family, passed away peacefully in her sleep after 3 days of illness. Each death hit the community hard, but especially the children. Daniel found himself conducting funeral services, not because he was clergy, but because Reverend Thomas had also fallen ill, and people trusted Daniel to find the right words. He stood in the cemetery on a hill overlooking Larkspur and tried to articulate grief and hope in the same breath. "We've lost too many this year, he said at the Morrison girls' funeral. "The flood, the violence, and now this sickness. It feels sometimes like the universe is testing us, asking how much we can endure before we break. But look around at who's standing here today. Look at the faces of your neighbors. We're still here, we're still together, and that matters more than you might think." He paused, gathering his thoughts. These deaths aren't meaningless. They're tragic, they're heartbreaking, and they're unfair. But they remind us why community matters, because we can't face these losses alone. We need each other to share the burden, to remember the people we've lost, to help each other keep living when living feels impossible. That's not a small thing. That's everything. Emma survived. Her fever broke after 4 agonizing days, and she began the slow process of recovery. Daniel sat beside her bed, holding her hand, and let himself cry for the first time since Catherine had died. Not just for Emma, but for everyone he'd lost, everyone the community had lost, all the grief he'd carried for so long without releasing it. "Why are you crying?" Emma asked weakly. "I'm going to be okay. I know you are. These are happy tears, relief tears. I was terrified, and now I don't have to be any more tears." "You're weird, Papa Daniel." "Yes," he agreed, smiling through the tears. "Yes, I am, and I'm very glad you're here to witness my weirdness." By August, the fever had run its course. The doctor from Denver arrived too late to do much good, but he confirmed that Daniel's protocols had been appropriate and probably prevented more deaths. He also offered Daniel a position as a medical assistant, which Daniel declined with the same reasoning he'd given the governor. His place was in Larkspur, with his people. As fall arrived again, marking a full year since Daniel had stepped off the train, Larkspur held a harvest celebration that doubled as a memorial for everyone lost during the terrible year. The new cemetery on the hill held 23 graves now, 8 from the flood, 3 from the violence that followed, 12 from the fever. Too many losses for such a small community. But the celebration was about more than grief. It was about survival, resilience, transformation. The town had been tested by every disaster the frontier could throw at it, and it had not just survived, it had emerged stronger, more unified, more certain of its identity and purpose. Daniel stood with Abigail and Emma at the edge of the celebration, watching people dance and eat and laugh, with the particular intensity of those who faced death and chosen life anyway. His violin was in his hands, ready to play when called upon, but for now he was content to simply observe. "Happy?" Abigail asked, leaning into his side. "Yes," he said, surprising himself with the simple truth of it. Not in spite of the hardships, but somehow because of them. Does that make sense? Perfect sense. Hardship reveals character. It showed us who we really are, and apparently we're the kind of people who help each other. That's worth being happy about. Margaret approached them, her face flushed from dancing with Pete Parker, a development that had the town's gossips working overtime. "Daniel, they're asking for music. Will you play?" He would. He always did. But before he moved toward the makeshift stage, he turned to Abigail one more time. "I have something to tell you about the future." She looked concerned. "What is it?" "Sam's been talking to me about expanding the school, building an actual schoolhouse, big enough for more students with separate rooms for different subjects. And there are 3 more families moving to Larkspur specifically for the education. We're growing, Abigail, not just surviving anymore, but actually growing." "That's wonderful news. Why do you look worried?" "Because growth means change, and change is always scary. What if we grow too fast? What if we lose the sense of community that makes this place special? What if—" She put a finger to his lips, stopping the spiral of worry. "Daniel Crane, you organized a disaster response, solved a shooting, survived a fever outbreak, and transformed a town full of strangers into a real community. I think you can handle some growth. Besides, you won't be doing it alone. That's the whole point of what we've built here. None of us are alone anymore." He kissed her then, in front of the whole town, not caring who saw or what they thought. When they broke apart, Emma was making exaggerated gagging sounds while grinning broadly, and several people were applauding. "Get up there and play, Crane," Frank called out. "Some of us are trying to dance." Daniel climbed onto the stage and raised his violin. "What shall we play?" "Something happy," Emma called, the same request she'd made that first day, a lifetime ago. So he played. Folk songs and dance tunes, melodies from Boston and new compositions he'd written here in Colorado, music that spoke of sorrow and joy and the complicated beauty of lives fully lived. People danced, children ran and played, and the sun set behind the mountains in its typical dramatic fashion, painting everything gold and orange and pink. As darkness fell and lanterns were lit, casting warm pools of light across the celebration, Daniel played one final song. Not something from Boston or Philadelphia or anywhere else civilized and far away. Something new, something he'd been composing in quiet moments throughout the year. A song about a town that had been broken and rebuilt itself stronger. A song about people learning to trust each other despite their differences. A song about a home that wasn't where you were born, but where you chose to belong. When the last note faded, there was a moment of profound silence. Then Sam Parker stood up, his healing shoulder still stiff but his voice strong. "To Daniel Crane," Sam said, raising his glass. "The man we laughed at, the man who saved us, the man who taught us that strength isn't about muscle or swagger. It's about showing up, doing the work, and giving a damn about your neighbors. To the only man in Larkspur we can truly trust, because he's proven it 100 different ways. To the best mail-order husband that ever was." The crowd erupted in cheers and laughter, affectionate laughter this time, not mocking. People raised glasses and called out their own toasts. To Daniel, to Larkspur, to survival and community and futures that suddenly seemed bright with possibility. Daniel stood there, overwhelmed, his face flushed with embarrassment and pleasure in equal measure. This was never what he'd imagined when he answered Abigail's advertisement. He'd thought he was looking for escape, for a fresh start, for a place to hide from grief. Instead, he'd found purpose. He'd found family. He'd found that the person everyone underestimated, the gentle fool with his books and his violin, could become the person everyone needed most, not by changing who he was, but by being exactly himself with stubborn consistency. Abigail joined him on the stage, slipping her hand into his. Emma ran up and hugged both their legs simultaneously. Margaret and Sam and Frank and Mrs., Chen and Reverend Thomas and dozens of others crowded around, all talking and laughing and celebrating not just the harvest, but everything they'd become together. Later, much later, when the celebration had wound down and people had returned to their homes, Daniel stood alone on the church steps looking out at the town. Larkspur at night was beautiful in its simplicity. Wooden buildings, lamplight in windows, stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. A small town in a big territory, insignificant on maps, unknown to most of the world. But to Daniel, it was everything. This was where he'd learned that running from grief didn't work. You had to walk through it. This was where he discovered that being different wasn't a weakness, but a strength, as long as you had the courage to be authentically yourself. This was where strangers had become neighbors, neighbors had become friends, and friends had become family bound not by blood, but by choice and shared struggle. He heard footsteps and turned to find Abigail approaching with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. "Thought you might be cold out here." "Just thinking." "About what?" "About how I came here expecting to start over. But you can't really start over. You can only move forward, carrying everything you were and everything you've been through, hoping it adds up to something meaningful." "And does it? Add up to something meaningful?" Daniel looked at his wife, thought about Emma asleep inside the church where they'd left her with Margaret while they helped clean up. He thought about the students he taught, the neighbors he'd helped, the community he'd somehow become central to despite never seeking that role. He thought about Catherine and Thomas, the people they'd loved and lost, and how those losses had somehow led to this, two broken people finding each other and building something whole. "Yes," he said finally, "it adds up to everything." They stood together in the darkness, watching Larkspur settle into sleep, and Daniel understood with absolute certainty that he'd found what he'd been searching for. Not escape, not redemption, not proof of worth or strength or capability, just home, just belonging, just the profound, simple truth that sometimes the person everyone laughs at becomes the person everyone trusts, and sometimes a mail-order husband shows up with a violin instead of a rifle and ends up being exactly what everyone needed all along. The Colorado wind blew cold across the prairie, carrying the scent of approaching winter and the promise of spring beyond. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human struggle and human triumph. And in a small town called Larkspur, Daniel Crane, teacher, organizer, reluctant leader, trusted neighbor, went inside with his wife to sleep soundly, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to be exactly who he was, which turned out to be exactly enough. The mail-order husband everyone had mocked had become the man nobody could do without. And in that transformation, in that proof that gentleness could be stronger than force and kindness more powerful than swagger, Daniel had given Larkspur something more valuable than survival. He'd given them hope that they could be better than they'd been. And in doing so, he'd become the one man they could trust completely, not because he was perfect, but because he'd shown them, again and again, that showing up with authenticity and compassion and stubborn determination to do right by your community was the truest strength anyone could possess.